Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. Today is Friday, the 21st of December 2012. The executive producer of today's show is Fox, and redundancy recording thanks to go to Fivecook. I'm Jules, and today we have returning to Time Monk Radio is Webbot founder Clif High. Clif has a doctorate in research and analysis, graduating from the School of Hard Knocks and Linguistic Puns. His website is halfpasshuman.com. Hi Clif, welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Hello. For a second there, I was going to object.
Denied.
That was pretty cool.
Cool. Before we begin, healing energies again go to Kathy and for her continued recovery.
Thank you very much. It's been very difficult, but we're in the recovery mode now, I believe. So she actually got out yesterday and was able to do some work and potted up some of these. What are those? I can't recognize the bulbs, but so she's done something, and it's like, okay, this is a big step for us.
Yes, very good sign when she can get up and start walking.
Yeah.
Here at Time Monk Radio, we prefer to have a discussion with our guest as opposed to an interview. And as you would expect from friends or colleagues sitting around a dinner table after a lovely meal, those around this dinner table tonight, either participating or listening in, are expected to be familiar with Clif's work. This is no small feat because Clif's vocabulary of topics is quite immense, from forecasting the future to scientific exposés on fringe science to meditating in chi, you name it, Clif knows it. But ideas come from critical analysis and strong discussion. And along with myself, Jules, and roundtable participants, Plain, Patrick, and Oolong Rabbit, we hope this discussion will spur ideas and thoughts in those that listen. So everyone please sit back, relax, as we have a discussion with Clif High, and maybe shoot off one or two profanities at the rat bastard powers that be. So, Clif, firstly, let's start off with temporal markers. Your work can be more accurately tracked when looking for temporal markers as opposed to looking for a specific time. History has shown that. Over the last 2 months, you've discussed in emails and wujos of some expected temporal markers that might lead to, I guess we call it the big three, global financial collapse, the death of the dollar, World War or Israeli mistake, and the global coastal event. One such temporal marker I recall is the exposure of the Catholic Church pedophilia prior to some market turmoil. As this may be our last interview with you, could you relay for us the major temporal markers that you're looking for? And maybe we can start off with the recent fire start or the firefighters fund that you were discussing in your latest article.
Sure. The firefighter, well, first off, let me just state that I'm going to bring out an end of the Baktun report here by the end of this month that is going to go through and list a lot of the temporal markers in as linear a fashion and connect them in as much as a connect the dots fashion as we're able to do, so that this will lay things out for the next 6 months and beyond insofar as our data shows. So we needn't be too concerned about getting into too much of the detail today, because we will have that. We have a number of pages into it, both now that Kathy's well or getting better, and my guy Igor's wife is getting better. She'd had some thyroid cancer issues herself and had a tumor removed, and she's getting better, and so now we were able to concentrate on work. Now, as to the temporal markers, actually, let's for a brief minute, let's discuss why that's the case. Why do we have temporal markers that line up really well and we're just wildly screwy on our picking of dates? It has to do with how I assigned values initially, because what I would do is I would find a word like hijack, and hijack and all of its derivatives go down to the word jack. And so in a current slang, you have the word, used as, I jacked that ride. Well, that word's an immediacy value word because it's got a short-term emotional impact. You don't expect to have that impact from jacking the ride. It's sort of an impulse kind of a deal. It's not a long-term planned event. And so we would assign a value of, say, 7 days to that. Well, that was the wild-ass guess component. But the analytical component was the relationship of the derivative jack as a slang, tracing it all the way back in the etymology of the word to hijack, and being able to determine that the word hijack would have a longer emotional duration value than any of its derivatives down to slang. And so I did this, basically, I say we, but over the years I just repeatedly, whenever I had a few minutes, I would sit down and do this on 300,000 words and eventually got to nearly 1,000,000 words. But it is obvious that it's once you get into the groove of selecting the words and tracking their derivation and their derivatives that you get a feel for it. And it is also reasonably obvious that the assigning of numeric values to it is always going to be goofy, but occasionally right. And so that's why we end up with this situation where, because the data presents itself, if you will, arrayed in a fashion that when displayed gives us the temporal markers one after the other, after the other, after the other. Sometimes it indicates a significant gap between them, mostly not, and therefore we get into the guessing game of, okay, how much distance in time is between these two temporal markers that are clearly indicated. And then to attempt to determine that, what I do is I drill down into the data, into the detail, and hunt for these things that I call cross-links, where we find the same word groupings in nearly the same emotional tonality in both sets, or I can see it a set that morphs over time through duration, impact, event location, or other numeric value into a different set, but its continuity is still there within the model space. I can sort of track it and say, well, and then basically, again, I'm guessing. What I do is I say, well, this transition looks like it's going to take about a week to go from this set of mainstream media language to this set. Now, frequently I'll be right, because that's related to immediacy language that usually has about a 3 to 6 day time frame, and so the accuracy rate with that can be quite astounding. But you have to catch it while the immediacy language is forming in order to be able to get this view of the temporal markers as they lay out. Sort of make sense?
Yep, it does.
Okay, so that's why we end up with the temporal markers actually being a really good guide, and the guesses as to dates on that being sometimes right and sometimes wrong. Now, the temporal markers we have, so let's look at the economic crash. I've got a temporal marker period of a cluster that my guess is that it's between the more accurate guesses I have, by the way, are where we relate them to astronomy. And so I can say, because the equinox is a key thing, it affects humans in a particular way, and so do the solstices. Curiously, we're at one right at the moment. We're able to plot those relative to the language, just like the full moon has an impact on the language. And if you were to track the internet and just do word counts, you would find specific words that respond to the full moon being out there. And people are just frequently using these words more often than not during that period of time. And it has a little peaked form of a bell curve shape that peaks with the astronomical event. And so we also note this with the equinox and the solstice very well in our work, and less so with the full moon. But that is why we're on a lunar calendar, is because the language runs on a lunar calendar in terms of the flow of it all. And so I'm able to say that between this equinox and this solstice, there's a whole lot of these events. Now, that's a big range. We're talking a 90-day period in there, and we're looking at a spread that could be clustered, could be tightly clustered, or it could be spread out to one event per day in terms of temporal marker. That becomes less distinct as we drill down, and so we then start making more guesses. But our largest temporal marker is for a post-equinox debacle of the markets. Now, by debacle, I mean a total, flat-out, contradictory mainstream media, continuous word flood about ongoing events that are occurring so rapidly that the media is unable to stay current itself, and feeds into the frenzy by misreporting events that have already occurred. So it will be that level of a crash. Maybe it'll be like 1929 for all I know, but not having lived through it. But the language would not suggest that. The language would suggest something different, probably something much more akin to the that weird spike crash we had in May of
flash crash. Yep.
Yeah, the flash crash. We were able to predict that a number of days in advance, simply because, I think like 18 or 20 days in advance, because it was within the immediacy range. And it was pretty good in getting that. Those same linguistic indicators are around, the same descriptors that I saw ahead of time for that event are the main sets of descriptors for the upcoming debacle.
So you've got
go ahead.
sorry, Cliff. You've got a bunch of descriptors that say there's a post equinox collapse, but then you've got like a single quote saying, the death of the dollar in November. So which is stronger of the two, do you think?
Oh no, certainly the number of indicators. Okay, here's the thing. Ultimately, the death of the dollar in November will be accurate because it will die probably pre-November, and some November that will be true, just like a broken watch is correct twice a day. And it was a strong statement. That statement of the death of the dollar in November falls into this weird category of language. We had, okay, let me say that within our own work, especially since we're fumbling around and I'm getting input from people as I'm going along, because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just stumbled into this and sort of inventing it as it's happening. I come across this data set way back when, like 2003. This data set was extremely prescient. It was almost all long-term data, and it had very weird cryptic statements in it, like the 300,000 killed, nation knocked back to a previous age. These kinds of things that were extremely accurate in events later on in a number of years down the road. In fact, that data set even forecast the context change of the data itself that led us to know that the emergence of the illegal aliens as a social body within the United States populace would occur at this particular time. So the data sets were very good in the long term, but they were exceptional. They were not, and they've never been repeated. I don't know why we got that set of data. It may have been a glitch in the program that I repaired. I shouldn't have. It was just a strangeness. And those data sets in the long-term data have always turned out ultimately to have been exactly correct. So, and that was where this death of the dollar in November came from. It was from one of those sets. That was also, unfortunately, where we have the 1.289 billion people killed. It's also where we have the initial set for the global coastal event. They all came from that weird set of long-term data that, like I say, so far everything in that set has appeared. Doesn't mean the rest of it will manifest, but I don't see any reason at this point to discount that. So I keep saying, yes, the data set for the 1.289 billion people is still growing, as is the one for the death of the dollar in November, and I'm sure that will be accurate. However, at the moment, that has a how do I want to say it is a single emotional spike that is out there in the data set in model space, as opposed to this very large, ugly looking storm of emotional values in this post-equinox, and it's really right after the equinox. So I would say from the 22nd onward, we're going to see some level of increased chaos enter into what we think of as the markets. And we see the thing already happening. The events that are going to occur in March were set up a couple of weeks ago when two different groups that form basically 3/4 of the planet decided they're not going to deal with the dollar anymore. So the dollar has technically died. Curiously, all this occurred in November as well. We saw the Southeast Asian organization that represents half of the planet in populace, which is 30 Asian countries, get together and say, we're not going to use the dollar for internal trading anymore. Y'all can piss off. And they sent Barack Obama packing. Wouldn't let him talk. He was there. He expected to have a participatory role, and he expected to have the aggrandizement of who he is and all of this. And he was just sorely sent home. And then at the same time, we had the BRICS people get together and decide that within their internal trading, they're not going to use the dollar anymore either. So technically, at this level, we've got the death of the petrodollar. The reserve dollar died November of the year 2012. Now, for us, the dollar still exists, and there's going to be another meme for that at some point, and I suspect it'll be between now and this upcoming November in 2013, in which, for the people of the United States, the dollar essentially wanes. And that is, we may, in like the 1930s, you had whole counties that didn't use American script at all. They had their own internal script because they didn't have any money to make change for any real currency. And we're going to see something akin to that in this country again, where there may be regions that use the dollar for decades, and it'll be an internally backed, local regional currency. And other areas will use gold, silver, or whatever. So at this point, when the massive emotional data, the weight of it all, and the duration values are all centered shortly after the equinox in 2013. They peak, I would say, within 30 to 40 days of that, and then start to wane off, and then we get hit by the global coastal event. And that's basically how those larger temporal markers lay out. Now, some of the smaller temporal markers, the firefighter fund issue, is actually occurring at this moment, and it was a precursor to two other smaller temporal markers that are in line to the first of the silver jumps. And then there will be a silver crash, not a crash, but a drawdown or a beatdown, or however you want to think about it, as people dishoard en masse, trying to capitalize on getting anything silver into the out of the sheeple into the system. That won't last but a few days. Then silver will go way up and continue to go up as we reach into March. So if we back engineer it, so to speak, since we've got the firefighter language starting to show up now, and we've recently had two other smaller, really small temporal markers show up, one of which was the announcement of the sale of the stock exchange, and that's associated with these other two smaller markers I'm waiting for, one of which is we've called Queens Exposed, and then the other is or exposure of Queens. And that'll be obvious when it occurs, and everybody, I'm not going to discuss the details, but you'll know it when you see it. And then the other one is the failure of surety, or the failure of the traditional safe path. And that relates back to the firefighter guys, because it's this weird thing where the data has an internal cross-link back to itself from in the future, so to speak. When we move the model space forward from point A to point Z, as we step through these various increments, these cross-links form that mature later on in the future as we move the model space from the original event. So I was looking for a firefighter set of language. It started to emerge. I think there's about a 3-week to 4-week spread before we reach the maturity of that firefighter language. During that period of time, I expect to see the Queens Exposed, and then at the very last of that, in the maturity, I expect to see the failure of surety, which I think relates to the retirement funds.
So the recent drop in silver isn't mature yet. We still have a ways to go down for the dishoarding?
No, we haven't hit the dishoarding yet. No, this is simply an attack. This is manipulation by the powers that be. This is standard mucking about with your mind stuff. Oh, no, we haven't seen the dishoarding. What I actually expect to occur, let's say that my numbers are wrong, okay? My numbers are going to be wrong, everybody. I don't know the numbers. But here is the spread that I'm anticipating, and we'll use numbers to describe that spread, and I'm just picking these numbers out of a hat. But let's say that the current price of silver was $30 an ounce, as the powers that be mucked about here on December 21. Well, 3 to 4 weeks from now, I expect it to climb up to, say, maybe $40 to $45, $46, maybe 49 or 50. I don't know, but it'll climb up. There might be, I'm anticipating a $10 range climb up at a minimum, so that we'll know that there's been this little rush up. At the same time that that's occurring, we'll probably be going off of this fiscal cliff issue thing that they're talking about, this manipulated political brouhaha that's ongoing. And there will be a wave of anxiety that's going to go through the sheeple. That will cause the dishoarding. And wherever we are at whatever number, we will see a near retracement to where we are today. So it's going to go up real quick and then come back down to where we are today, and then it's going to go back up again in fairly short order. It's not going to hover around. They won't be able to beat it down anymore. It'll start behaving more like an actual market should relative to commodities and demands and that kind of thing. And then we'll also see the disconnect between the outrageous spread between silver and gold at that same time. So right after the dishoarding is when the temporal marker for the ability to manipulate gold and silver ratios starts to break down. And that's really the indicator. That is the key indicator for silver being on what I would think of as its perpetual rise from that point forward. And by perpetual, I mean at least for the next few years.
Do you see government confiscation, Clif?
No, that's never been an issue. We see taxation attempts like mad, and stupidity leading to people getting their gold and silver taken away from them, but not any kind of, there's never been any language that says we're going to come and take your gold by force, or we're going to close down the banks and steal your gold. They're going to do that, but there's never been any language indicating that they will announce it or any of this. So the approach to getting your gold and silver is primarily through taxation. You're going to see all kinds of laws that basically say any sort of a transaction involving anything other than currency is going to get the hell taxed out of it because we don't want you doing it.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks, Cliff.
This is, by the way, another reason to consider the Bitcoin thing too, because Bitcoin, in spite of in spite of a lot of people thinking that it's a globalist plot, is mathematically a fairly sound, algorithmically good approach to developing a scarcity around a commodity in a controlled fashion and not having people being able to manipulate it. And you'll notice that Bitcoin's been rising in its relative price to the dollar. And that's going to continue because the guys in the powers that be realm are starting to beat back on Bitcoin, which is going to excite the interest in it pretty directly, actually, just the way that their pressure on gun control has led to increased gun sales. The blowback issue cannot be discounted anymore. And just on that, Bitcoin is going to go maybe 2 or 3 times its current value in relative to the U.S. dollar. But of course, the dollar is falling, 3 to 4% a month anyway.
There's been a few attempts to set up an alternative currency system, sometimes precious metal backed, and it seems like every time somebody does that, the powers that be kind of pull out all the stops to give them a good smackdown.
I agree, and that was what led to Iraq war. That was, there was basically an alternative to the petrodollar. They didn't want to exist. Plus, they wanted to also snatch whatever it was they looted out of the museums there. But it was basically a currency war issue. And but the problem that if we isolate the powers that be, and we say, for instance, that the Russian executive administration and the Chinese executive administrations are not directly tied to what we think of as the globalist cabal and are not directly under their sway, even if they are their own horrors and potential problems, then we're basically isolated the powers that be to what we can think of as the extent of the old Anglo Empire, and is now backed up by the muscle of the United States. This being the case, the nature of the world in which we live has fundamentally changed in November with the statement that the petrodollar has died, because it has died. The only place it's really inexistent is between the Anglo Empire and the captive slaves in the Middle East. They won't be captive very much longer once they can trade in articles of real value for their petroleum and get, Chinese and Russian gold, this kind of thing. Under those circumstances, that really fractures the ability of what we think of as the powers that be to exercise any form of global control the way they could from 1945 through to, say, the mid-'80s. From that point on, the American empire probably started its waning effort. Now I see the ability of the powers that be to exercise force in the planet decreasing daily, and it has taken a huge hit recently and it was inevitable, but it was at the same time done in a very quick and decisive manner that kind of caught a lot of the powers that be guys off guard. It was really a shock, and it's been reverberating through the Tavistock and the Council on Foreign Relations in the last few days in some of the changes in language. They're now starting to realize the death knell is there, and that the organizations the pathway that they had designed is not occurring. So we're now into a much more indeterminate world, when the United States could effectively, for instance, extend its power around the planet by its control over the oceans. It was a truly global power. That power is essentially gone now for a number of different reasons. Because all you have to do, for instance, is to deny the ability of the navies to transit out of the Strait of Hormuz, and you've trapped all of, a huge amount of our ships in a 26-mile area that's a shooting zone. So it's not as though we can extend power the way that we used to, especially now that Russia and China and India are self-actualizing at this level. So I don't see the powers that be being able to slap down Bitcoin or even the other alternatives, Loom and a few of the others, to the extent that they had in the past. And also, they've now run into, as the big news Brzezinski noted, they've run into the blowback effect, where there's so many people paying attention to them, their mere fighting brings people out, very much as though we were in the 1789, and it's a thing of all of us guys sitting around the village waiting for an attack by the aristocracy's troops, misguided troops, and we just have to decide, okay, which side are they coming from, and then it's to the barricades. We all run that side and start pitching stones and stuff at them. And true, it's we don't have cruise missiles and these kind of things, but you get enough people pitching stones, it doesn't matter if you've got cruise missiles.
Hey, Cliff.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. This is Plain. A lot of us are probably suffering from collapse fatigue, I guess you might say, in the sense that we've had this discussion for a long time about are things really changing dramatically. And it certainly seems to me that the language has changed. I mean, 30 years ago, a stock market collapse would have meant, an 80% collapse. And now I see headlines when it's only gone down 3% that they say it's collapsing. And so I think we're running into one question right there is, what do you see? I mean, are we really talking about an 80% economic decline, or are we talking about the 3% that the headlines are going to say is a collapse?
No, I'm actually discussing a systemic collapse, not numeric. The kind of information we have in the data for all these years has been describing a collapse, which has been basically a slow grind down, as Catherine Austin Fitts describes it. And indeed, even Lindsey Williams, he talks about his powers that be buddies who are talking about basically grinding down the middle class, and the bastards are going to wear us down until there's nothing there. Well, that is one level of collapse, as you've described, where they're putting the words against a lower and lower metric over time and basically attempting, if we were to put a why to it, I think they're attempting to generate some level of emotional attachment to the words and being able to manipulate it on numbers. But what I'm discussing is not that form of the grind down. I'm talking about the grind down going up to the point where the system itself doesn't function anymore. And so maybe we don't want to use the word collapse because it won't really be a market collapse in the sense of there would be a market after that. It will not be a market collapse in the sense that the stock market would be a meaningful thing, even relative to the 1930s. In the 1930s, after the stock market collapsed and had its crash, the 1929 crash was followed by the 30 crash, and then we had the bond crisis in the 32, 33, and 34 period, along with the bank holidays and so on. And so from our perspective, everybody says the Great Depression began with the 1929 crash, and that wasn't really true. It was a bond crisis in those 3 years that led to the huge level of the depression and the despair in the late 30s and the war in the early 40s. Now, in that period of time, the United States was isolated. The effects were more contained. Here we have a situation where we're more globalist, so the effects actually have to be global, and that's why it's taking so long. That's why the process has been ongoing for probably 20 years, where we're looking at a 7 to 8 year process in the 30s. I actually thought it would occur the other way back when. In the 90s, I thought, because of the rapidity of communications, it'll happen very fast. But it should have dawned on me, because of the rapidity of communications and the ability to spread the emotional impact around globally, because of that communication itself, it was going to delay the onset of that emotional reality as it manifests. And so it was going to take time. But now our data is describing not a situation where the market's going to go down, X number of points, and everybody will say, oh, it's collapsed, horror. Yes, that will occur. But our data is actually describing a systemic breakdown, such that over a period of 40 to 50 days, the breakdown will not merely be in this market, equities, or that market, currency exchange.
Clear. Then you're basically strongly disagreeing with Catherine Fitz's view that modern robotics and very cheap gas in the U.S. and a couple of other things, technological, are going to allow the powers that be to have this controlled demolition. Right. You just see systemic collapse.
I see systemic collapse, but I'm not disagreeing with her. That is indeed the plan. Their idea is the grind down in the long term and so on. I'm just saying that my data seems to point to some kind of an exogenic occurrence. I don't believe that the exogenic occurrence, I mean, there's nothing in our data to say that the exogenic occurrence is like a meteor coming down or an earthquake that starts this process off. More the data would seem to suggest that the exogenic occurrence is some kind of a unanticipated incompatibility between systems that had been unforeseen, much like the Hertzstadt effect of the bank lockdown that almost occurred. And but this is totally unforeseen because it appears to come out of the derivatives, and it is somehow connected at this point with the language that's emerging around the firefighters. That's what I know. How the collapse will manifest, I've got thousands, perhaps even millions of words describing the systemic breakdown from various different viewpoints, because it's going to affect weird things like, gas delivery and electricity and so on. And basically it's a money issue. And then we also have, as a background to that, we have these earth changes that are going to go on, and then we're going to get hit by the global coastal event, all within a very short period of time. Within that period of time, I've also got data showing that somewhere along here, maybe as part of this process, maybe as a political move, I don't know what the motivation is or what actually causes it to occur, the banks are just going to say, well, screw it, and start unleashing all of the foreclosures that have been held in abeyance. And they're going to unleash the foreclosure process with a vengeance. And so all of a sudden, you're going to have an extra 4 or 5 or 6 million people worried about their housing. We have very strong, clear indicators for that. We also have very strong indicators that the housing market itself takes like a 50% walk in maybe a week by this action, either the actual dumping of the foreclosures or the fear of it, and where everybody's thinking, oh, geez, in my county right now, there's like 2,400 properties for sale. And the rumor is that there's 3,000 that are held currently in the foreclosure mill. And if they were to dump all of those that they own now onto the market, that would double the amount of properties, more than double, and that still wouldn't clear out those that they can foreclose on. So at some point, this reality is going to intrude, and I think that that's part of the systemic collapse. What actually triggers the systemic collapse, I don't think, is market direct. It doesn't appear to be that way, because it appears to come out of this link between the Vatican Church, pedophilia, and the islands of Great Britain. I can't tell if it's England, Scotland, or Ireland where it specifically originates from, but it is that cross-link connection that begins the breakdown process shortly after the equinox at the systemic level. So it may be, denial that they've got to pay. It may be saying that you can speculate as to what the actual cause is, but that's where the as close as we can get to is the originating point or trigger.
So you think they won't have Skynet ready to roll out before it collapses?
It exists now. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of, the idea of the movies, the Terminator movies, that kind of thing, a variant of it exists now because I can go out and look at it. All these flying triangle guys and all of the other giant, huge tube things that are out there and the big square box ships. Somebody's up there with something.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, though, is that in the movie, you get the idea that human society can cease to function and the robotic civilization would still go on, is my point.
I dispute at the moment, having been in the computer business, I dispute the whole idea of artificial intelligence as is frequently portrayed in movies, etc. If it exists as it is portrayed that way, as people would have you believe it could exist, then that is truly an extraterrestrial thing. Because the nature of computers that we've got now, they're entirely deterministic. Even if you gave them the ability to feel, which I say is a prime prerequisite for artificial intelligence, because without the feeling feedback loop, you can't develop consciousness or intelligence, in my view. But they're deterministic, and so even if you gave them sensors at a level that would allow them some level of semblance to feeling, they are incapable of imagination, and that is also a prime prerequisite of intelligence, is the ability to have imagination. A worm, for instance, is not particularly intelligent. As far as we know, it has no imagination. Rats, that's not necessarily true. Rats are very intelligent, and you can get, it's not a size issue or anything, it's just merely my dispute that there's a certain threshold at which a certain number of chips would become aware, because awareness implies requires feedback loops that causes you to have self, and you can't have self unless you can feel something, and that is part of the consciousness process, and that engenders imagination. And so artificial intelligence, the idea that there's a machine out there that can anticipate my move, I do not doubt, okay? But that was the ability to anticipate my move was designed in a software program that is entirely deterministic and works on a probabilistic understanding of universe. Knowing this, I can easily defeat that continuously just by knowing I need to do so and not be deterministic.
Do you remember the Doctor Who show?
Sure.
The Doctor Who series? You remember how the famous Dr. Tom Baker said he could never see how the Daleks were so impressive because you could always defeat them by using the stairs.
exactly. Or climb, and Daleks can't look up. Their range of vision is only so high.
I was going to say that sort of segues into the Breakaway Civilization meme. Is there any way you'd be able to talk a bit about that, Cliff, what you think the Breakaway Civilization is? Are they related to the powers that be, or are they extraterrestrial, or would you be able to touch on that?
I don't know about we know that the extraterrestrial component is involved. It's speculation is to say that the Breakaway Civilization is controlled by them. I'm certain that they are interacting with them in some way. What the relationship is probably far more complex than we could ever imagine, simply because of the levels of agenda. Let's stop for a second and say we have to understand how limited we are. Before we get into the idea of the Breakaway Civilization, I'll define it for you real quickly because it's very easily done. Catherine Austin Fitts has got the best definition at the moment. The Breakaway Civilization are these people that are bleeding us dry, taking all of our money, and think that they can kill us. So far, they've demonstrated this with impunity anytime they wish, using weapons that we cannot even detect. These death rays and things, right? Okay, so that's the Breakaway Civilization as best that we need to define them at the moment. But here's something that we need to understand. We are not only limited by our senses, by our ability to feel, by our concepts of reality in terms of thinking things are solid when they really aren't. We are limited in our minds, and we are self-limited in our minds, not merely by our prejudices, our psychoses, and neuroses and other derangements, but we are limited in our minds by our language. And this was acutely brought up to me when I did this work way back in the 90s. Because I started moving out of English into other language as the internet really started moving into other languages. Initially, it was an entirely English-only thing when I first started playing around with HTML in like '89. It was just this early process out there, and it was all in English. Anyway, so we started moving into other language, and I note something about English and relative to other languages. So, for instance, Latin is probably the best language on the planet for discussing the nuances of time in ways which we cannot replicate in English because we don't have the words and the understanding of those words to get down to this level. And that actually is what made Latin a very difficult language for people to learn and comprehend the conjugation and the declining of all of this all this originated as a way of dealing with time. We have Greek, for instance, is a great language for dealing with emotion. But all these languages can be categorized in various different ways. And so let's look at how limited English is to other languages. So in English, we've got basically 4 kinds of language. We've got declarative language, where we say, that is a cup on the desk. And then we have interrogative, and you say, is that a cup on the desk? And then we have subjective, where we say, or subjunctive, where we say, basically the cup on the desk is the subject that we're focusing on. And then we have the negative, where we say there is no cup on the desk. And that's basically it. You're taught these in school. It's not any big deal. You internalize them. You never really think about it. But you don't realize there are some languages that have more than just those 4 modes. They've got modes like Japanese is this really cool thing. And it takes the Westerners a long time to grasp what's going on. But the Japanese will say this word to you, hai, and hai, H-A-I, and it means a lot of things. That's its problem. It is probabilistic mode. It is the Japanese can say to you yes, and you're not sure, are they saying yes, are they saying maybe, or are they saying no? And it's all the same word used in probabilistic mode. And so for getting back to Latin here, we've got rhetorical mode and oration mode, and all of these modes don't exist in English. And so we are limited in our thinking by not having these modes. Other languages have modes that are really strange, like they even have predictive modes and modes designed to be quoted. So they have a quotive mode. Some of the more elegant languages are actually the tribal languages that are hugely rich in particular modes because they relate to the environment from which they derive. Now, getting back to the Breakaway Civilization, here's where I think that we're going to have a schism. Most of the planet now is adopting English with its limited mode functionality, and at the same time, through the internet, it's spreading out. It's become ubiquitous in flight control, finance, medicine, all different kinds of areas. English is a predominant mode of using for discussion, and it is limited to these four modes. We're losing a lot of the richness that some of the other languages bring in. This will become very acute in dealing with the Breakaway Civilization, because here's the problem. They're dealing with a technology. All right, so let me stop for a second and say one last thing about our language that's really key. Our language works in a stop action mode. This I discovered in doing my work, that all of our language is basically describing events in the past from our perspective. There are a small subset for describing words in the now, and there's an even smaller subset that are basically useful for the future, unlike Latin, where they have huge amounts of words for future, past, etc. In our language, we have these very discrete modes of thinking that are lined in built into our language structure that make us very good at technology, makes us very good at machines, because, for instance, machines can be conceived of as operating in these various step modes. Your car, internal combustion engine, computers, anything can be conceived of as operating in a stop action fashion, and allows you to engineer them very well, even though you're actually dealing with a process. When you turn the key on, the car doesn't go into each of these modes separately and stop after each one in a perceivable fashion by you, even though it was engineered that way. It was engineered that way with a language that was designed or that deals with the reality in a stop motion fashion. Whereas the Breakaway Civilization guys are dealing with a technology that cannot easily be grasped in a stop-action language fashion. It has to be grasped and held in your mind as a process, as a morphing, continuous, dynamic, emergent manifestation that is basically change, continually bounded by certain levels of constraints. And you need an entirely different level of mode in your language to discuss this and design for that in an effective way. And I think that the longer we go on, the larger the barrier will exist at this basic language, even if English is the basis for both of us.
Just on that note, Clif, you recently suggested or recommended the possibility of regular humanity collaborating with the Breakaway Civilization. I got to tell you, there's a lot of skepticism about that. And under what scenarios do you think that they would even want to work with us?
Oh, they don't want to. Oh, that's assured. They don't take kindly to the suggestion. I'm quite certain that they're going to discount it entirely. But
it would be more of a self-preservation type thing then.
Well, no, exactly. And see, this is the thing. I'm sure that that suggestion was met with the same level of understanding by the Breakaway Civilization, should they have encountered it, as the British encountered the suggestion that they simply leave India when it was offered by Gandhi. I'm not offering myself as a Gandhi by any way, any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying that on the other end, they will meet my suggestion with the same level of incredulity that the British met that suggestion. There's absolutely no reason for them to take it seriously. But it must occur. And the reason that it must occur is because they are dying. And I think a lot of them know it, or some of the guys at the very top know of it. And they know that they're dying for the same reasons that I know they're dying, and it's because they cannot exist as a parasite. They need to. They're really trapped in a bind. Okay, they've because of the nature at which this started, and because, if you want to listen to Michael Tessarian, because of the intrusion of evil into our planet, many of these individuals find themselves trapped, that are in this breakaway civilization, are trapped in a particular situation where they are working on a path that they know leads to greater and greater evil over time. And they don't wish to pursue this path, but they find that they have no effective alternative because they are trapped within that system. What I am offering is in a way in which we can get that whole system to basically fold in on itself and collapse by offering basically truth and reconciliation absent retribution, as must be done. You got a lot of people, for instance, I'm not a big fan of revenge at that level when the situations that cause the initial revenge need deteriorate. And are no longer existent. I'm a pragmatist in that level. Someone has done me wrong, but if they did me wrong, even if it was done deliberately, but it was circumstances, and those circumstances have changed, and there's no longer any need for me to feel a threat from them, etc., there's no longer any need for me to put that energy out there and be revenge motivated. So the breakaway civilization finds itself in the following situation. They've been killing us for years. They've been killing lots of us for years. We can go down the list of the woo-woo guys that have been slammed and nailed by these fellows. Many of us have been threatened by them. I've had my life screwed over by them. I've been fucked over by them, and they're probably doing it to me now in a couple of different ways. Why they should care about us at this level, I don't know, but they do care about us probably because we are points of irritation that grow. And so they probably look at us that way. But they know, the guys at the top know that parasitic civilization cannot grow to the point where it consumes its host, and we're right there. The level of consumption of our planetary resources necessary to kick the breakaway civilization into its next level of growth will doom us as a source, as a host, if it is done at a parasitic level. Not so if it's symbiotic. Not so. And I'm not saying collaboration in the sense of, Vichy France or anything. I'm saying subsumation. We need to take them over. We need to subsume them in an Aikido fashion without using force and let them attack us, let them find our restrained energy centers, move away from them, take them off balance, and pull them in and take them over. And then decide as a species just what the hell we're going to do and how we're going to go about it. Because if we don't, we're going to be faced with the Ridley Scott view, where corporations go on out, and corporations are the ultimate thing that is out in reality in the future, mucking about with all of this stuff. We need some organization, is my statement. We can't do this anarchistically. We can't do it in a voluntary fashion, other than we need to volunteer to an organization where there is a level of personal integrity continuously, and I think we can get that by always living in the now and by doing it that particular way. Now, the breakaway civilization is really at a very key point at this time, and to a certain extent, that call I need to take later has some bearing on this. But these guys are, they find themselves murderers. They find themselves associated with murderers. They find themselves doing evil, and it is not a good thing. They recognize this. If it is true, the number of interactions that they've got with the extraterrestrials is complex, and these guys have placed themselves in an organization. The humans, terrestrial humans, have placed themselves in this compartmentalized organization whose very structure limits their ability to grasp and perform effectively in interacting with the extraterrestrials, who will have a greater level of language, who will have a more organized, cohesive structure to deal with. We are at a disadvantage, and I think that these breakaway guys know this. I think that they know the limitations of their own structure is crippling their next move because they haven't been able to do it for probably the last 5 or 10 years. Now, the minion class, and, the Zionists and the Rothschilds and the perpetual wars and all of that, how that figures in, it starts getting really complex. But I don't think that there is a organizational pyramidal structure that we can point to that says that, this guy works for that guy all the time. I think it's like the CIA, where you're spying on your boss for your boss's boss, and your boss is spying on you for his boss. So there's so many spies on each other that you just don't know what's going on in that regard. But I have discovered one thing, and it's probably quite risky to say so, but I'll go ahead and say it. It's my supposition, based on the language alone, that if I had to go and hunt for the whole in our social order that leads to the controllers. Now, whether this is the breakaway civilization or not, I don't know, but I know that these are the controllers of the minion class at a level. If I had to get at them, you know where I would go? Tavistock Institute. The reason I say Tavistock Institute as opposed to Tavistock General, because Tavistock Institute is the controlling organization for a number of bodies on this planet, including the psychiatric and the medical and the pharmaceutical industries. And that if we look, Tavistock Institute has been associated with every change in psychiatric, it's been with, associated with psychiatry ever since the great addict himself, Freud, came up with it. And they've morphed it, even beyond his crazed imagination, into this truly horrific tool. And a lot of the Tavistock guys were associated with early Russian psychiatric repression of the populace under Stalin and the Bolsheviks before him. So I think that's where the hole is. I don't think it's Tavistock Institute. I think if you'd go through there, you'd find whoever it is that's the controllers, or whatever it is, because I'm not even willing to say it's even human. But the breakaway civilization, I think, is definitely not dealing with things that are human. And that definitively is because the technology I've seen out in space, I've seen two kinds of craft with these goggles I've got that are not as humans would engineer them natively. They're not on our progress path, just the way actually transistors were not. Integrated circuit chips were never going to be developed as a result of the approach we were taking with vacuum tubes. In fact, we were headed the other way with very sophisticated vacuum tubes that had all kinds of radioactive substances in them and structures and so on. And we were building a technology that actually would have developed and headed us towards crystal control structures. But instead, we took in the 50s, right after 1947 and the crash, we started developing integrated circuits and all of these other technologies that have led us to where we are at the moment. We may have gotten there we already had television in the 30s, that was vacuum tube designed, and so we had a number of different television methods in the 30s. And so we totally avoided digital. So we would have arrived at the same level of technology, I think, with an entirely different approach to getting there natively if we hadn't had this intrusion in 1947. Since then, we've been off in the digital world. We've concentrated on English. A lot of these things have narrowed our focus and eliminated a big swath of potential technology for us that maybe now there's some indications that the breakaway civilization really wants to go out and explore. And again, we find ourselves in a situation where the breakaway civilization controlling something that interacts and steals money from us. I don't know that the breakaway guys are controlling the minions, but I sure know the minions are aware of the breakaway guys and the thefts that are going on and are reacting to it, or I don't know if I want to say feeding them or not, but they participate at some level because they're undoubtedly being fed themselves from it.
Clif, does this have anything to do with the part of your report that says the powers that be will reach out and bitch slap, I'm supposing, the breakaway civilization?
To a certain extent it does. It's not directly, though. The powers that be are going to... There's a schism that is developing in either the powers that be, because this is so complex and because we don't really have a player's card. We can't say that the Petraeus works for the breakaway civilization. We don't know that, but we sure know that the CIA has a big hand in whatever is going on in the breakaway civilization. So we can't really say that his actions are part of this faction or the other faction, and a lot of it is speculation. We have to deal with it in a very broad language. So our language suggests that the powers that be are going, and the minion, as expressed through the minions, are going to take an action relative to the bitch slapping the breakaway civilization, because we're at that same point I was just discussing, where you can no longer continue as a parasite, as a parasitic interaction. And the powers that be are going to be squeezed by this and are being squeezed by this. Now, if we look at what's going on, look at how all the money is accumulating in the 1/10 of 1% of 1% of the populace. But at the same time, are these guys any happier? Are they apparently any wealthier? The minions and their Wall Street guys are showing big bonuses and so on, but at the same time, the huge money is not showing up anywhere, and I think that it's all being siphoned off, and these guys are the minion class, the powers that be, are aware that push has finally come to shove, and as the system crumbles, they're going to react. This is where it's going to get real interesting. I don't know if there's any reason to suppose that the Space Goat Farts entity was correct in suggesting that as part of the global chaos following the global coastal event, we would actually see the breakaway civilization. Our data breaks down because of the shift into immediacy data, which I can discuss at length because I've been analyzing that recently, but it breaks down, and then we end up with this period of silence or dead holes in terms of the amount of data, and then it slowly starts trickling back at an extremely small level in terms of the forecast, and such that beyond June-ish, the forecasts are less voluminous in terms of the amount of data we have to work with. But there was some indication in Space Goat Fart Entity that the rebuilders after the global coastal event will be rebuilding in an environment in which the breakaway civilization will be at least acknowledged, if not daily seen. Will it mean that it's integrated? I can't say.
Yeah, we've been talking to Clif High from halfpasthuman.com, from Temporal Markers to Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep. We'll have a break and we'll catch up in a few minutes. Okay, we're back with Clif. Yes, Clif, you had something to say about the breakaway civilization?
Yeah, if we look at exactly what's going on, the breakaway guys got technology from space aliens, reverse engineered it, had to do it in secret because of the paranoia that existed that was basically promulgated by the powers that be. The breakaway civilization guys at some point got enough power. These were like colonels and majors and so on in the military structures of all these various different militaries around the planet, that they broke away and started interacting among themselves on their own, separate from and mostly without the supervision of the powers that be. And the breakaway civilization gradually moved off on its own, driven in part by the nature of the technology that they were dealing with and its inherent schism with the powers that be itself. And the schism is important because we're finding ourselves at a situation where our planet is being sucked dry by the parasitic form that the breakaway civilization has taken, and a lot of that has been engineered into the system inadvertently in a series of inadvertent consequences. And we can examine some of those and see the pressures that are on the powers that be, and why, if we have this offer out there for reconciliation and reabsorption, it may actually be at least an opening to some level of valid discourse. And here's their problem. First off, you have to understand, they are not breeders, okay? The breakaway civilization, for a number of different reasons, is not heavily into breeding its next generation the way that we humans are, because you need the planet to support the breeding operation. You can't do this in space, and you can't do this underground. And so they get their recruits from us, and they know that. And they're faced with a situation where the powers that be have engineered a society that is dumbing down their potential recruits, and they need every bit of brains they can get. The powers that be have got so many people within the Anglo civilization, from which is their main recruiting point, on the psychiatric drugs, that they've eliminated a huge portion of the population as potential recruits for this breakaway civilization. The rest, or a large number of the others, are not fit physically because of the diet that they've been on, again, engineered by the powers that be for mind control purposes. Now, it's antithetical to the guys who run the breakaway civilization, because these fellows at the very top are highly educated, not necessarily extremely, many of them are also extremely well schooled and educated in spite of that, and understand what's going on because of the nature of the technology that they're dealing with. By all reports and by all analysis, the kind of technology that they're dealing with is basically what we could think of as spiritual technology. It operates at a level beyond the electromagnetic spectrum, and it calls into all these questions the very nature of consciousness itself, which these people in developing this technology must wrestle with these issues. And they're aware of this, and it makes them more spiritual over time. So this is why I say that there is an impetus within that civilization not to continue on an evil course, because the very nature of the technologies that they're dealing with point to an awakened and aware universe, materium in which we live, and the harmonizing with that energy is what is successful as in that technology. And the opposition to that energy is not as successful, and these guys will recognize this over time and gradually be moved by their interaction with the technology, just as we as a social order have been moved by our interaction with the digital technology to shrinking our conceptual basis down to English and restricting ourselves to the 4 modes of language, because that is more in tune with this digital stop-motion form of interaction with the reality, which is actually a process. And so the Breakaway Civilization guys find themselves in a world of hurt. They need really smart people that can be very spiritual and interact with these technologies as aware individuals, and they're not being bred anymore. The people that they're trying to suck the life out of energetically in the form of the money to buy the goods and then eventually recruit people and so on, they're finding that the money is going to be less useful because their recruiting basis for resources and stuff is disappearing. And they are aware of this at the very high level. I'm quite sure of that. I would say, 99% sure that they grasp this at the very high level, because they are making some motions to attempt to do something about it. This brings us back to the idea, before segueing onto the global coastal event, and probably why so many people will die, to the idea of where we find ourselves now with the Tavistock Institute and its connections to CERN, which is in Switzerland, which is the head of the planetary psychiatric movement, the cult of psychiatry, I call it. It's a cult. It's a religion, actually. Technical definition of a religion is a cult that survives the death of its founder. Sigmund Freud, this great fellow who was a Zionist pedophile who was addicted to about 9 different substances, and who died an addict in abject misery, and whose addictions twisted his own mind, formed this idea that we call psychiatry, which was given the force of law and power by the powers that be because it was an excellent tool for their ends. It was later on merged into the Big Pharma industry by Tavistock Institute when they took it over in the late 40s, early 50s. That was when they really Tavistock Institute started really making its big push into psychiatry. And from that point on, they started warping our social order, and with all of their twisting of the language and all of this kind of thing. And it has brought the situation to where we find ourselves with at the moment, especially in the United States, well, and even globally, everybody's now aware of it. Look at the world in which we live in. China is irritated, and the people in China are commenting on the school shooting in the United States on a near real-time interactive basis. This is truly a new planet. And under the circumstances, we've got ourselves with these children who are taking pharmaceuticals that are described as medicines, but they're basically chemicals that have been engineered to do some very specific things. And then these chemicals put these individuals into a specific mindset, and then we give them a technology that has within it violent images in a stop-action motion, digitally reinforced, high-speed, high-frame rate, flashing, intense-driven, emotional impacting device that we call the video game or video game industry. And you get a guy who basically sits there. His mind was damaged to begin with, as I understand, was further damaged and controlled by the pharmaceuticals, the medicines that they were giving him, which are chemicals, that warped out and focused, by the way, and I can discuss that at some length because I've lived with it for 35 years with the people that are taking these medicines. but it focuses you in on and you spiral in on those flaws in your brain. That's what these chemicals do. And so they spiral in on those parts of the brain that are most repetitious, most ingrained to building the same neural pathways and not building new neural pathways. And then you get on things like Call of Duty, which is nothing but a simulation on how to kill. And we say, we're surprised when such an individual locates the method to go out and actualize what his brain has been trained to do by the social order. And so my response is that a gun is a tool. It's like a screwdriver. It's like a hammer. It's like a pair of pliers. It's like a car. It's like a microwave oven. It has a very specific purpose. Its purpose is to inflict lead projectiles at some target in the distance. It is a killing device, and it should be treated as such, but it is a tool. The devices themselves don't jump up and kill people. The social order entrains people to use them to kill, and it's doing a very good job of it. And the very first thing I would do is to ban the video game industry and put all of these guys I know out of business. That brings me up to the second minor point there. I know guys that are in this industry, and some of the people that are my age that are getting ready to retire out of it are horrified by what they've been a participant in these last 15 or 20 years, and the level at which the engineering has gone to direct brain manipulation. And one guy says, where in the hell does this technology come from? He's being given code that is not originated on site, and yet it's folded right into their patent-pending work, and nobody says anything about it. And when he brings up the subject, they look at him and say, you're only 4 months from retirement, aren't you? And that's the hint, right? So there is a deliberate design going on with this stuff. It's necessary that we have these simulators, but you see what's going on with the simulations being unleashed in the public. It's by design. Breakaway Civilization, I don't think, likes it.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. I mean, there's so it's just an incredibly long topic, and unfortunately we're limited on time, but maybe if I can suggest, I mean, if you maybe dedicate a Wujo in the future for the Breakaway Civilization, Alien Wars, The Return, things like that. I mean, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, that's a good idea, yeah.
Okay, Cliff. With that, obviously we're now moving towards, so we've been discussing about financial collapse and other topics. This is essentially looking, if your data is right, that's all going to be crammed into the next 3 to 6 months. With that said, and you discussed the silence just before the break. What are you expecting in regards to the global coastal events, particularly when you referenced things from Courtney Brown's information of no government and no vehicular transportation? What does it really imply?
I actually suggest that we're going to get if we didn't have there's a single element in the data that supports the idea of intrusions from outer space. And that single intrusion, or the single point of data, is in our data. It's also in Courtney Brown's work. In our data, it's textual. In his, it's also textual, as well as in images in some of the remote viewing. And that is when people look up. And so I actually suspect that we're going to see a plasma event. And the plasma event will be a frothing at a sunspot that won't produce a CME, but will excite a sympathetic response in the plasma in the atmosphere of the Earth and create these incredible shapes and hugely gorgeous, very dangerous electrical occurrences at the same time that we have a high energy stream that comes into the middle of the planet and triggers or initiates or causes, however you want to think of it, a plate crack in the Pacific plate, the way we had a crack in the Indo-Australian plate for the Banda Aceh earthquake. And so the global coastal event at that point we will be contending with a lack of electricity, because the plasma events will operate as very widespread, not necessarily global, EMP kind of events, and cause disruption, static, may burn out some levels of electrical service. It's not necessarily guaranteed to destroy the grid in total, but it may do a huge amounts of damage globally, depending on what part of the planet is facing those plasma events when they are created, because they will be created on the same side of the planet that is sun-facing, and there will actually be a counter effect on the opposite side of the planet, which will be a drawdown of the magnetosphere as it is warped around to the plasma event. Now, that will actually be a very dangerous spot to be, which will be on the dark side of the Earth, directly opposite the plasma event, because from that perspective, you'll be bombarded with extremely high levels of radiation, perhaps even killing levels of radiation, may even ignite forest fires for all I know, that will be in the dark, absolutely without any visual indicators. And it'll be, the outpouring of all the high energy X-rays and all this kind of crud. Now,
sorry to interrupt, Cliff, but that's actually a given, because 13,000 years ago, I mean, you can see the beryllium spikes and the carbon-14 spikes. But sorry, continue on.
Yeah, of course. Now, yeah, okay, but now carbon-14 we have to discount because it's gone wonky since the sun's gone wonky. So it's only good within each cycle and can't be used between cycles. The beryllium and iridium, though, I grant you, is indeed a long-term indicator. Okay, so we got plasma events on this side. At the same time, we got this high energy coming on in, and I think it's just going to trigger it. I don't think it actually is going to cause it, but the Pacific plate's going to crack. Where exactly is immaterial at the moment. If we're lucky, it'll be south of Hawaii. If we're not so lucky, it'll be north of Hawaii. In any event, the global coastal event will be initiated by that. It will be basically a bathtub kind of surging in the oceans. The surging will have to travel around the planet, so it'll take some time to get to various different places. But the Pacific will see it probably within that first 24 hours. Everybody that's in any way touching the Pacific Ocean will have encountered the tsunami and the surging. Now, the surging will not be giant dam waves everywhere. There will be waves, but it will depend on where you are relative to the crack in the plate. Behind the crack in the plate, you might get tsunamis that might be 2 or 3 feet high. In front of the crack in the plate, so to speak, in the main thrust, close to it, we might get tsunamis that are at the maximum possible level, which is about 120 feet, based on coastline. Some areas, the maximum possible level might only be 6 feet, might still be devastating. This will be the kind of event that was described by Courtney for Courtney's work for Fort Jesus in Mombasa, because there you've got basically a low-lying coastal plain of some 100 plus miles in width. And in that area, what happens is the water rises up and goes back 72 miles to smack into the mountains. And because it's a coastal plain, the water need not be that high to travel that whole entire distance, because there's basically nothing to break it up. On the coast of California, it won't be that same way. You'll get a very high wave in a very narrow beach area that will just sort of like scrub everything all along the northern coast down towards Baja. And then the wave will continue out, and so we'll see parts of Mexico that will be relatively unaffected, and parts of Central America that will miss the majority of it. And then a big chunk of South America will get it pretty directly, both from the ancillary wave that goes down the coast and then the direct wave from the shattering. But at the same time, we're going to have all these other weird effects. Because of the plasma, I suspect we'll get evaporation. And that evaporation will be on both sides of the planet due to the pressure differentials. So we'll just all of a sudden have huge amounts of the ocean water that's decided it's going to go up into the atmosphere and join the atmospheric rivers and go truck about. It might only be 12 to 15 hours before we start seeing exceptional rain patterns in places due to this effect. How long it will continue, I don't know. As you mentioned, the petroglyphs and the beryllium spikes are associated with the petroglyphs of about 13,000 years ago. And then we also have petroglyphs that we believe are over 40,000 years old and go back 2 cycles. And those petroglyphs up here in the Ponderai Caves, which are now blocked from anybody getting into in Ponderai County, are pointing to a multi-decadal kind of a deal. Now, if we assume that as time goes by, the process here moderates, this makes sense. If you think about the sun dragging Earth behind it, and DJ Sadhu did just a beautiful video of that, but if you think of us being dragged behind the sun, as we get bigger, the impetus is to be further away from the sun as we're dragged along. And this is what accounts for the gradually increasing orbit that we've had, where we're not gradually, but stepwise increasing orbit. Every so often, every cycle, we get a little bit larger, our orbit increases. Before it was 365.24 days, which is what we've got now, is 360 days. We actually got records of it going back to where there was a 300-day orbit that is discussed in some of the glyphs in the Mayan calendar. They knew of a period of time where we had a 300-day orbit. Also, the Jain cosmology also discusses a 300-day orbit and a much smaller Earth at that time, and we were much closer to the sun. Now, as we get bigger and we fall back behind the sun, these events that are going to get us, the plasma events, can be expected to be less each time. And this is told to us by what's known as the Narmer plate, which is this much disputed and now probably hoaxed up disinformation ceramic plate that comes to us from a pre-Egyptian time, in which they detail 11 of the last 12 of these cycles. And they note that each and every one of the cycles decreases, and that many effects decrease from cycle to cycle, but then every 3 or 4 cycles we would get a nasty one. But even that cycle itself was decreasing. And so there's a lot of reason to suspect that this time our cycle will be such that the majority of humans will survive, whereas last time that was not true. And that appears to be the duality that's been expressed in the Narmer plate. They say that, 5 cycles back it was horrific and there was barely 2,000 breeding pairs of humans that survived. But that the 4th cycle and the 6th cycle, there were basically millions of people that survived. And I think we're going to get in that sort of a situation now. It's going to be if you will, a light catastrophe. And the global coastal event, the surging, is not going to necessarily drive waves all the way into Kansas, isn't going to necessarily flood out Utah, although we do have predictions of major flooding in both Kansas and in the Utah area from the rainwater. I don't think it's going to be the salt water. How long the events are going to go on, I can't say, because our data and the Courtney Brown experiments basically end in June 1. And maybe, and I suspect it's an ongoing process, that it should go on for at least a number of years.
Hey, Cliff?
Yeah.
I've got a question about the RV situation. So there's Courtney's study, which pretty much everyone listening here is a little bit familiar with. And, there are pros and cons to that. But you also had an RV study done, or maybe 1 or 2. I don't know how many you had done.
Two of them, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. I can give you some level of detail that does not betray a lot of the personal stuff, because in doing these studies I used myself and my wife as anchors. If you've got an anchor into the future that is existent, it helps if that anchor is participatory in the process, if the experiment is designed correctly. And so the validation studies that I've done have an advantage over Courtney's studies, because using myself as an anchor, and I'm a self-aware individual, I was able to say that, yes, the RV work was remarkably prescient, because the way I designed the study, they had to get certain things accurate about me now in order for me to have any sense that the rest of it was valid. And the stuff that they got accurate about Kathy and myself now turns out to be extremely valid, including having foreseen her medical condition. Okay, and I attempted to do everything I could over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 months to derail that future, to see if it was possible to alter a timeline with foreknowledge, and I was not able to. And this led to a huge level of distress and emotional problems on myself, as I kept running into not being able to push the future and derail it. I did not share with her that this was a potential, because I didn't want to have a self-fulfilling prophecy and add to that burden. And I did everything I could to shield my knowledge from her, and yet we still end up in this situation where she has the health crisis, as was foreseen by the validation study. So in that sense, it's like having my data sets where some of it's happened, and so I have a lot more confidence in the rest of it that's hanging out there. Make sense?
Sure. But what about going forward then? In other words, at some point, it's not simply the personal side, it's that, Seattle is underwater or something.
Sure. Okay, let's get into that then. Okay, so what we have here is that the validation studies that have the most level of verbiage and the most level of descriptive and emotional character were done by the females involved. The validation RV work that were done by the males are the most descriptive of the surroundings. And so let me give you an example. So the women note that a particular structure is a luxury house, whereas the men don't note that at all. They note the garage off to the side and the cool equipment in it, okay, and the nature of the driveway and the trees around it. So it just gives you a different feel for the way that the minds work. So taking that into account here, and blending the two descriptions, The validation studies suggest that sometime before June, and the way I targeted this, it was actually end of May for our target. So I'm pretty sure that it occurs in the time frame that the global coastal event data would suggest, which is post-equinox and before the solstice in end of June. But in any event, it describes a situation in which a major earthquake has hit the planet. Now, this major earthquake is not the 10-0 that is described by Patrick Garrell, but from the point that the earthquake hits here in the Northwest, effectively, from our viewpoint, we are isolated in communication for potentially decades. It is that severe. The earthquake is so severe that maybe 50% of Seattle does not survive in terms of the structures. Very little of Tacoma would seem to remain. This apparently is a geologic issue, that there's a particular ridge that's going to just shake like mad in through the Tacoma region. And there's going to be a nasty period of instant loss of electricity. Now, let's back up a bit. Okay, so we're describing the validation study that was done, and I'm blending two studies because the data was reasonably accurate in both, more accurate in one with the increased number of women participating. But in these studies, we're looking at a point where they say, okay, here's what you look like at this point at the end of May. It didn't happen at the end of May, so we sort of like rise up into the air and float back in time and try and see it in a reverse engineering fashion. And so that's sort of what I'm going to describe to you. And then I'll describe to you where it takes us from that point forward. So we have a situation that by the end of May, the global coastal event has occurred, but our first indicator of it up here in the Northwest is this huge earthquake that damages everything all around. The earthquake is so bad that trees fall over. Very rare thing in earthquakes, really. And the infrastructure, electricity is essentially taken out with no foreseeable return. It's taken out to such a level that the social order has started to degrade by the end of May. And in our one study, it seems a very high level of what I would consider immediacy language is available. So the degradation of the social order leading to the basic anarchy, robbery, and all of that is occurring very immediate to the time the remote viewers connect with us in the end of May. So it might be at that point that, say that this was the last week in May, then we may actually be encountering it at that point in time. And the data suggests that, I'll let that go. The data suggests that the robberies are going on. We're aware of them. We're able to see some level of the chaos from the cities, from our particular location, although we're not participating in it. We're aware of the total lack of communication. All satellites are down. All the internet is down at that point. We don't have any of the services that one would think of in terms of gasoline or any of this. They're at the time of, and then if we rise up a little further, we can go back in time, which is closer to where we are now. So we're looking at it from June, looking back to where we are now. And sometime between the robberies and this point where we're at now, there is a period of time after the earthquake occurs where people who are aware of what's going on make a break for it. There's a number of indicators that individuals with prepared bug-out bags and vehicles and stuff get out of Dodge and are successful in doing so, because there are indicators that collectives emerge in the local hills around here because people are so freaked out by the earthquake. Whether they're aware of this talk or aware of our discussions or aware of Courtney Brown or not, I cannot say. But for whatever reason, they know that the next thing to expect is the water intrusions, and so they get out of the low-lying areas.
So it's the temporal marker then?
Correct. A huge one. Actually, there's so many in that period of time, it's very hard to not stumble over them. But the temporal marker is that the roads are reasonable, clear, people have enough gas and so on, and then it degrades very rapidly after that to those people that have made it out, and then that's pretty much it. Lots of people are remaining in the cities and the affected areas, either unaware of what's about to occur or unable to get out even if they are aware, or are encountering, violence or assaults and robbery and that kind of thing. There is no sign of any government, though. Yeah, continuing with that. So So we start off in May. We have the robberies. We go back into earlier part of May. Some point in there is the earthquake. That's our first indication that the global coastal event has occurred. Maybe it's in the end of April. I can't really say. It might be even in March. But it occurs because time is not treated the same way in the RV stuff. And I'm just applying certain indicators for, this word is, I think of it as immediacy language when I see it in the remote viewers work. And I can't not do that. So I have a tendency to apply these mental filters to it. But leaving aside my guesses as to the time, we know it has occurred by late May, and that I'm sitting in a location where I'm not at now, and I'm in a position to be able to observe what's going on some of these levels, and that we're noting myself and other individuals that are around, we're noting all of these things down as this cycle ends. And part of the end of the cycle is the earthquake, and then the remote viewers go up and they turn around and look the other way, which is the future from May of this 2013. So they're looking into June, July, and August. And at some point, there is a very large intrusion of water into the Puget Sound area. Not the kind of thing that might be expected, a giant tsunami. That may occur. If it does at the time of the earthquake, I'm unaware of it, so it's not commented on in the remote viewing because of where I am in my particular location at that point. But on the other hand, by the time we get into the June, July, August time frame, we are making notes, apparently, as to the level of the water intrusion and what's going on relative to Puget Sound. And so at that level, or at that point, it would appear from the description that we're getting a more or less permanent increase in the water level height that, let's just say that it could be as much as 40 or 50 meters in height. This would tend to suggest that at some point in the future, maybe as part of the global coastal event. Now, this is a guess on my part. This is a speculation. The data is that the water comes up maybe 40 or 50 meters in the Puget Sound in a reasonably slow fashion, not a giant wave or anything, but tides just coming in and not going back out. And so to my mind, this suggests that as part of the global coastal event, something has slipped off of Antarctica and altered the level of water within the Pacific Ocean. And that is probably what accounts for this being a global coastal event that takes a number of years, because some of the things we show in our data, not the Courtney Brown stuff, not the remote viewing, but in our data going way back to 2003, we showed that it would take 2 years for the global coastal event to hit Finland. And this makes sense if it's a water level increase as a result of that, having to cross the 6-inch boundary between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean and alter both the Atlantic and the Pacific and so on. It's going to take a long time to affect all of the planet, but ultimately it will.
I believe Ingo Swann predicted that the ice shelf would collapse into the ocean as well, Cliff.
Okay, I'm unaware of that. I'm sort of aware of Ingo because of his, I was reading about his magnetometer experiments as part of the remote viewing work. And it makes a lot of sense that his early work there, without the clutter, is probably a lot more prescient. And then there's one other thing here. There was this guy, a remote viewer, and I can't think of his name now. He was a military subcontractor. He's the most honored military subcontractor ever in terms of numbers of medals from the military and this kind of thing, and he was a remote viewer. He found Amelia Earhart's plane 15 years before anybody even knew where it was. And apparently has a hit record that is just truly phenomenal. And they won't tell you what he sees for next year, and he won't say anything about it. As far as I know, he's relocated to high ground. And that's something else, is that I've known of people that work for and retired from places like JPL that are retiring in specific locations because of the work, and that's basically all they say. And they're moving to places like Colorado and high ridge mountains in Montana and so on.
Yeah, Cliff, I think I've heard on a grapevine that the 2013 Remote Viewing Conference has been cancelled, so that's a bit interesting as well.
Well, hey, then they know something. Yeah. When was that supposed to be held? Do you know?
Plain,
June.
would you know?
Yeah, June. It's always in June.
There you go then. Yeah. Now, here's the thing about this. Courtney Brown is, he's a guy that's like Patrick Garrell. He's on one of these restricted calorie diets. His idea was to live to be 115 by controlling his diet, right? I actually don't buy the theory. It only works if you have certain assumptions that cannot be applied at an individual level in my thinking. But nonetheless, I believe that it makes both Patrick and Courtney potentially subjected to an imbalance in the amino acids in the brain, which can lead to certain conclusions that are not necessarily accurate under the circumstances. Most of these conclusions are actually formed off of emotional imbalances that occur because of the lack of the amino acids. Doesn't mean that it means they're crazy, basically, in the sense that they have crazy making things within their diets that would tend to make them less calm than an ordinary person, perhaps. But it also does not invalidate the study that he designed, because I've had people say, oh, well, Courtney Brown's this really thin, crazy old bald guy. How can you trust what he says? And it's like, well, he may indeed be crazy, he may be thin, he may be bald, but he's a mathematician, and he didn't do the remote viewing. And the people that did do the remote viewing also did part of our validation study. And these guys are scary good. And so, I have no doubt that Ingo could, count the number of freckles on your butt if he wanted, no matter where you were, based on the technology. There's different protocols, though, for it. So I've run into issues relative to the two validation studies that we've had. They were done with two separate protocols. And I think the one is probably the one they used by the Hawaii Remote Viewers Guild is probably the more valid of the two, because it provides more descriptive potential for what's going to happen. Now, by the way, the remote viewer validation studies that we've got don't extend beyond September of next year. And in that period of time from the event, the Global Coastal event in the latter half or prior to June, whenever it actually occurs, from that point on, up until September at least, we have not seen a reemergence of what can be considered any governmental authority. I don't want to say the survivors, but the rebuilders, those of us that are going to rebuild afterwards, are not at that point apparently having to contend with anything that even resembles local government. Now, some of the here's some weird stuff. Okay, I've discussed this. I tried to get the information to him privately. For whatever reason, I think, or for whatever reason, he's not open to discussions with me, probably because I've irritated him. But in one of my remote viewing studies here, with the validation study, not the one done by the Hawaii Remote Viewers Guild, although they had some elements of it, but this other one that was done, there's this particular descriptive scene. And I can actually peg this scene if I've pegged the personalities right, because I know when this personality is supposed to be there. But the scene is describing Hawaii after the event, or after a precursor to the event, or a partial component of the event, because we don't know how long this is going to take. I assume it happens in a day, but it might be over the course of months for all we know. But here's the situation. An individual is sketched by one of the remote viewers. This individual is sitting on a rock surrounded by other survivors of a horrific earthquake and tsunami in Hawaii. I think they're on the Big Island from the description I've got. The description, the little sketch really looks like the Big Island. There's some indication that there's volcanic activity in the background, but not immediately threatening. And these people have been kicked about by reality, and they're basically shell-shocked, like, Sandy kind of survivors or Katrina survivors or Banda Aceh survivors, wandering around what's going on. And here's this particular individual seated on this large rock, telling all of these other people, leave me the hell alone. I don't know. And get this individual, the sketch that I've got from this guy in Europe who is part of the validation study, it looks like David Wilcock. And whoever this individual is, whether it's David Wilcock or not, it looks like him in terms of the few little line sketches we've got. And this individual is in a situation where he's worried about his girlfriend or wife. They wrote wife in the description, who is missing in the event. And this individual is in Hawaii. This individual is looked to by all of the other survivors as somehow more knowledgeable than the rest of them, who should know something, and they're looking to him as the local authority figure, and yet he's so traumatized by the event that he can barely stand up, and finds himself in this position. We actually get a real good description of the emotional qualifiers around this individual, and just my looking at him in terms of the little tiny 7 lines for a face drawing I've got, it looked like Wilcock. And then a lot of the language seemed to remind me of him. And guess what? That Wilcock fellow is going to be in Hawaii February 15th. What's going to happen February 15th? DA 14. That's the day that asteroid passes through. Coincidence?
Well, we don't know if there are any coincidences, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I've got a question, though, about the RV there. Okay, so we've got a global coastal event, and it, hits the Pacific hard. Okay, but then how would they pull off World War or an Israeli mistake?
No, that's actually occurring at the time. According to our data, this is the commonality between the Courtney Brown stuff and our global coastal stuff that I was writing about in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. Within our data and the long-term data from that set was continuing references to the soldiers look up and then throw their weapons down, and the soldiers look up and see something in the sky and just say, fuck it. And whenever the officers say, hey, get back there, got to go back to war, the soldiers just shoot the officers and go on about their business. And the battlefields are left with bunches of dead officers and littered equipment, and everybody just goes home because of what they're seeing in the sky. Now, our data showed that as a precursor to the global coastal event itself by a number of days, or within that period of time that the global coastal event is occurring. So it is my supposition that what's actually being referred to is the increased tensions that will occur, the sololunius ramping up, if you will, and the Zionists going crazy and launching the war, perhaps even days before the global coastal event occurs, but certainly not months and months before. In this case, if they got it started right away, they might have everybody engaged just in time for the global coastal event to occur, and all the armies to say, to hell with it, we're going home here. Now, we also note within Courtney Brown's work that same look up in the sky and go home thing occurs, although they don't specifically relate it to the armies the way that we did within our work.
Well, okay, but then you've had a long-running meme of an Israeli mistake, right? And even like cities being turned into glass and various horrible things. And one would imagine that if Israeli cities got turned into glass, that it would be a wider thing, right? Syria or Turkey or other places might also.
Okay, but yeah, I understand what you're saying, but here's what we have to understand in that.
I know it's the monkey mind at work again, but I'm just trying to bring it in.
The temporal markers for the cities being turned into glass have not gained any data for, maybe 2 years, 3 years, something like that, even longer. But the Israeli mistake continued, and the Israeli mistake morphed over time as the data. There was one, I don't know if it was the Alta reports or the Shape reports, but I wrote about it reasonably extensively, where the Israeli mistake had shifted from a large mistake to millions of little mistakes that would lead to a situation where there was troops on the ground and warfare, but not the attack on Iran and not the 50% loss and that. We actually saw that fade away. They have ended up losing that opportunity. The Israeli mistake still continues because they're attempting to take it another route. And so the most recent growth in the Israeli mistake subset had nothing to do with the glazed over cities or even Israel per se. It was the most recent growth we had in the Israeli mistake subset was about a Zionist nuclear attack on the United States as an Iranian, as a false flag to get us involved with the Iranian mess. And that was part of the stuff I alluded to in the talk with Mel, I think it was, where I didn't want to go into the details because it had yet to occur at that point. But the Zionists, I said, were going to make a really nasty mistake and expose themselves. They did make that nasty mistake. They exposed themselves. And as a consequence of that, we've seen some 36 Zionist-dominated or controlled military guys removed from the U.S. military, surreptitiously and even out in the open. And there's all kinds of stuff going on, if you will. There have been changes in who was slated to be in directorship for committees in Congress. There's also been changes within the military as to who leads what sections and committees at very large levels. And so this whole mistake was exposed.
Clif, don't forget the real thing. The new head of Lockheed was forced out. Power.
Yeah, and hey,
and minor subcommittees in Congress and crap like that. The real deal.
The real deal, the power in the corporations, and we're seeing that elsewhere. And look, it actually exposes the factions. And so the Zionists did make some huge mistake, which I don't know what that mistake was, but they opened themselves up to a level of vulnerability that's now being exploited. They will go, though, in terms of they will attack. There's going to be a larger ground war involved at the time the global coastal stuff goes down. I don't suspect it'll be the way the data laid out. It seemed as though these guys had not. It wasn't like Gulf War where we were building up for months and months and months and months, and then we finally attacked. Okay, it was very much more of a situation where it was a short period of time before the global coastal event occurred. Weeks, maybe a month. I wouldn't think more than 2 months at the outside. So if they start going to increased battles in Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and all through that area in March, then that would be a good time frame, and it'll probably happen at the end of April.
So, Cliff, do you see Obama turning on his Zionist handlers the way Putin did?
He already has. I don't think Zionists like Obama. I think our data here, if things were to continue, the trend would suggest that they would eliminate Obama by the end of this coming year. He'd be assassinated or removed some way. I don't think it matters. Just like I don't think a lot of the worries matter, because the global coastal event was the discontinuous disruption. Now, it may not occur. I don't see how it won't at this point, because we've got so many of those temporal markers falling. But the preponderance of the mass of the data for the global coastal event, as I've described it, shows that by the same time as Courtney Brown's work and by the same time as the remote viewing validation studies that I've done. Now, I set the time on that, but still to have them show up with that data as having occurred was quite accurate. And then one other aspect of all of this is that the military is giving indications that they think things will occur by the same time frame. And then we also have the other subsets there, okay? The Israelis are making, not the Israelis, the Zionists are making mistakes at the bankster control level, and the systemic crash is coming. Even people like Max Kaiser, who's been long reluctant to say, oh, it'll happen by this time or by that time. He's actually taken bets that it'll happen by the end of April. And because he can see the same systemic weaknesses that I do. And that, again, was a precursor to the global coastal event. And what we can think of as the onset of that may happen a month and a half, 2 months before the global coastal event, but a good peak of it is reached perhaps only weeks ahead of that. We're still in the emotional throes of this language when we're hit by all of this, by the global coastal event showing up, and at the same time that we have the increased level of warfare going on, the currency collapses, and what we can think of as the systemic market degradation is not going to come back regardless. And we might be in a month of that, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're hit by the global coastal component of it.
So this is what you discussed on Coast to Coast, I think, in 2009. You saw a 3-month period window where everything would happen.
Correct. I didn't know it would be 90 days specifically, but it's within that, I would think, maybe 4 months to the outside. And it really does appear that we're getting really close to it. And I like I say with the validation studies, if you knew, for instance, look at this. Okay, so here's the thing. You get a validation study from remote viewing that says you're going to be in a car wreck on a particular time period. And you do everything you can possibly do to avoid being in a car on that day. And you've got it all set up. You don't even have your car there. You've thrown away your car keys. You've locked your door. And you know what's going to happen? From my experience, I'm just using this as an analogy. What's going to happen is you're going to have a medical emergency, and you're going to have to be thrown into an ambulance, and it's going to be the ambulance that has the actual wreck. And the universe will have you have that experience should it desire it, should it demand it, regardless. So I don't want to be deterministic or fatalistic about this, but the remote viewing validation studies have convinced me, especially these past few months that I've been living through, that there is no other timeline. There is no possibility that time is being changed in that manner and shifting us all out of harm or any of that kind of crud. I don't think it's even a matter of degree, and I'm quite convinced that Courtney Brown does not understand time in a meaningful fashion relative to his own study. And I'm also quite convinced that his study does not show what he thinks it does, which is a divergence of two possible timelines. And to a certain extent, to a total extent, I'm absolutely convinced of this, that it's going to occur. In my mind, it already has occurred because those things I have been told about occurring months ago have already occurred. And I've lived through them at a level that I appreciate at a personal level, the same way I've been living through it for years with the larger data. So it's a really weird position to be in. I don't want to be like a prophet. I don't want to have any of these kind of roles. But basically, I'm saying to you that, my understanding of time now is that we are inexorably stepping daily to this event, which will occur over this period of time as we've described it. And that's, unfortunately, I wish I had a more precise way of describing it so it could be more meaningful. And so because I'm sure if we had a situation where we could say, at 2:20 a.m. on this particular date, this small precursor is going to happen, and then it actually happens. And then if we could do it 3 or 4 times in a row, maybe everybody would pay attention and, we could get some kind of en masse movement. But universe apparently does not desire that.
So I'll go ahead. Go ahead,
Cliff,
Blaine.
is there like an RV study you'd like to see done? I mean, do you think that would help with both the global coastal event and the World War situation?
I don't worry about the World War situation. Curiously, I'm sanguine about that because it won't last. It's a brief flash that is destroyed by intrusions from outer space. So, our ability to destroy ourselves that way will be taken out of our hands as we suddenly all try and cope. I'd love to see a validation study about the period of time for this time next year. That is to say, December of 2013 and January of 2014. And I would like to see that validation study focus on something that is extraplanetary, like a satellite or probably the moon would be best, because I suspect that we would be able at that time to have a look back on our planet and see what's going to be happening relative to the breakaway civilization and the potential for extraterrestrials, et cetera. Because when we've had this stuff kicked out of us, at the same time that all this was going on in that data back in 2003, and I was getting all these really good long-term sets that were focusing on things that were horrific to my mind, 300,000 people killed at that point. I had yet to encounter the 1.289 billion number. That came a couple of weeks later as that set matured. But at the same time, a number of items started popping up, and I was forced by the nature of the data itself to evolve the Space Goat Farts entity. And it was at that time that we had that entity pop up because of the nature of the changes in the data. And it also associated with that long-term set through cross-links to the Space Goat Farts entity was all this stuff about the farmers having to, defend themselves against space aliens with shotguns, an alien invasion, people, beings attempting to colonize Earth, some interaction, some confrontation on the moon that is visible from down here, all kinds of really cool stuff, sci-fi kind of stuff. If you're really an addict as I was, this is all cool stuff. But now now that we have the remote viewing work and the previous or in the history of these years, to show that the work was actually valid. We've had Banda Achi, we've had a number of these things occur, and so that set was really good and packed with good prescient knowledge. I would like to have an RV study done that says, okay, what does humanity as a species have to deal with a year from now? Because the gap from June until December of next year in our work and in the remote viewing work, it didn't even deal with it at all. But in our work, that gap was very significant because it was during that period of time that we had forecast the appearance of this attempt to, I don't want to say invade, but come on down and settle. Maybe we can think of the invaders coming into the earth the same way that the Israelis think of their settlements, right? As opposed to having to think of them from the Palestinian view as an invasion. We can just, it's just a bunch of settlers. And in fact, on this interview I did that'll be appearing tomorrow, I characterized it a slightly different way, where I said, well, here's what's going to happen. Sometime in the period from June until December, white people are coming from outer space with all that implies. And if we're all native people, and as we recall here in North America, the white people showed up, and the next thing we know, we've got, smallpox-infected blankets heading over towards what, used to be one of the largest nation states on the planet without a central government. And some 30 million Native Americans were dead in a few years. And some point in the future, I think these white people are showing up, and we need to be prepared to deal with them. So I would really like to have this study done to see if they're here by December or if they show up shortly thereafter. In other words, do we have 6 months to start rebuilding and get our shit together, or are they going to be on us right away?
Cliff, if I could ask a question. It seems like the collapse was originally engineered, but perhaps it got out of hand on the powers that be. What are your thoughts on that? And also, do you suspect that the powers that be were trying to manipulate events to make prophecies appear to be fulfilled?
Both of those are true in my understanding. I think they are attempting to manipulate events, and thus the Project Bluebeam and so on. And I believe that they are engineering the grind down that Catherine Austin Fitts describes, and that also is described in a different way by Lindsey Williams, where his elite guys say they don't want the collapse. They want to grind us down over the next 4 or 5 years. And I'm just saying basically that their plans will be disrupted. The best laid plans of men, aft gang agley. And the universe is going to come along here and smack us upside the head. It kind of disrupts their plans totally. So also government. The collapse is an unexpected event for them. We actually see that level of fear rise sharply within the data, within those entities that track the powers that be in the media. When the economic frothing occurs and starts feeding back on itself, the CNN not being able to keep up with what's going on, and the MSNBC spouting off stuff that's not true, that sets off erroneous responses, which feed into the whole loop and all of this kind of stuff. These guys are as surprised by these events as anybody, and this is shocking to them to the point that we all realize that there was a tell that if you were okay, some of the sheeple are going to be looking at CNN and all the cable news things, and they're going to be saying basically, what the hell is going on? Because the calm, assured state that they normally see as these people feed out the manufactured news that they all know to be lies will be gone as these people try and react to events that are happening so fast that they're not sure what's lie, what's true, what's they're supposed to be saying, who they should be saying it to, what agenda they should be tracking, and without that guidance, they look like real doofuses. This came through in the data, this breakdown of composure, if you will, that comes through from the media. That alone tells me that the powers that be and the media are not expecting this to occur.
Okay, thanks, Cliff.
So Cliff, I'm just finishing up on this area. The global coastal event is, I guess, one part. We don't know if it's a part of the natural cycle or if it's a man-made thing, like you said, a space alien ship crashes into the Pacific Ocean. But what's given, I guess, is that, whether it's now or in 100 years, the Earth expands, and I think you believe in that as well. So if the Earth would expand and we expand from 365 days into 380 days, we're going to have a lot of other problems. Like, 60% of the large mammals died 13,000 years ago. So does that mean that taller people would be disadvantaged going forward? How would gravity affect us? So, like, what else do we expect apart from the GCE in the next decade, for example? What your data shows anyway.
Well, you're quite correct in that tall people are disadvantaged, and they're that way now. Even though we've had a growth spurt in the human species in the past, in this cycle, in these 13,000 years, it's antithetical to the general trend, because we note that that which survived the last cycle was the smaller mammals. And we're in a situation where the dinosaurs died off because the planet expanded underneath them, and the gravity grew to the point where they couldn't, their vein and artery structure couldn't handle the ability to transport blood, and they all keeled over and died more or less. And the species was not regenerated because there was no capability for it to do so. Theoretically, if this were to continue 2 more cycles or so, you might see humans where the top size of the human is very much like what we would think of as the little gray aliens, where a tall person might be 5 feet. And, most people would be 3 or 4 feet high because of the gravity issues. But that's a multi-cycle thing. Within this cycle, apparently, my calculations based on what I think is the harmonic that's going on in the cone. I was doing some what's known as Vedic math. And I took and hypothesized a particular size of a cone relative to Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Earth, and used that as a projection, and then shifted us back. And I figured that this cycle will grow about X% that will yield something less than 14 days added to our orbit. And because of the nature of the size of the planet at this point, I think it won't be less than that, because there appears to be a pattern where there are these predictable jumps in the orbital size, and then a slower predictable jumps or lower predictable jumps, and I think we're at one of those lower predictable jumps. So we'll gain like 14 days, and taller people would be disadvantaged, but this is also good for us because, see, here's the deal. the reputed from my contacts with people that have offered themselves up as having had contact with space aliens in the dark black objects world, and there's some reason to think these people these people have told me stuff that I can validate, and it is factual. I can't validate everything they say, obviously, but I'm just going to take some of the things that they've said. One of the things they say is that they're dealing with these space aliens that are rather large, on the order of 7 to 9 feet high, and that these space aliens wear suits like biometric suits, so in masks, so you never get to see their faces. And I think these are the beings that Kerry Cassidy would describe as the Anunnaki. I don't have a whole lot of detail about them, just this description of these beings in this one particular meeting that this individual went to. Anyway, though, so I was thinking about this, though, because I'd run across it a long time ago in terms of a physics experiment, that this one guy had done a physics experiment and said the human race could never get higher than 8 feet 6 inches in height, because once we crossed that particular threshold, the very first time you fell as a mature adult, you would die. No matter what you did, if you would fall that particular arc at 9 foot high, your brain would impact the inside of your skull and turn to guacamole. Even if you tried to slow your fall down with your arms, if they were proportionally to you the same way arms are to humans here, you wouldn't have enough distance to slow down your speed relative to the arc of falling. And at the rate of 32 feet per second, you'd be, your brain would be moving at 250 miles an hour kind of a thing inside your skull when your skull suddenly came to a hard stop, and your brain would slam into the inside of it, and as I say, turn to guacamole, and that would be it. So this is good for us if the Earth expands enough that these beings are, disinclined to show up here. But those biometric suits may also be, capable of dealing with gravity and this sort of a thing. So I'm not putting too much faith into that, but still, it does offer some hope for us regular humans in dealing with giants kind of a deal. But also, look at this. You got people out there that are really fascinated with giants on the planet, and they go out and they dig up all these giant skulls, conehead skulls, really, mostly, 2 sets of teeth, rabid, skull deformations that we would think of, but native to them.
6 figures. Yep.
Correct. And all these guys were very tall. Now, I know of a situation where an individual I know of participated as a student and had her life threatened because they found a bunch of these conehead guys with red hair, which really shocked her, mummified with regular humans. And the conehead guys were all easily 9, 10, and 11 feet high. And they had one individual that was a good 1.5 feet higher than all the other coneheads in there. They found these mummified remains. It was due to a washout. It was somewhere in the southwest, and Aurora had washed into a cave. And when they went on into the cave, they found another cave that they broke through a wall, and there was all these mummified remains, as though the people were taking shelter and gotten trapped by a river that had flooded around them. And there were just regular humans there. There were mummified remains of horses, or desiccated, let's not say mummified, desiccated remains, and horses, dogs, sheep, no cows, a number of birds, no birds of prey, but birds we wouldn't recognize today, and these very large conehead individuals. Now, these individuals existed on this planet at the time that the planet was smaller. We don't see them today, not because they have left, but because the planet is so large that their species would not survive here in that form, and especially with the thicker bones that they had. So, because one of the things that this young woman remarked upon was one of the skulls that had been fractured and how thick the skull material itself was. So even though their cone head was very large, the brain was not necessarily that much larger than ours. It was due to the nature of the skull and what it was apparently attempting to protect against. And so, these remains were snatched away. Everybody had the absolute blood scared right out of them by the people involved in this, and it all went to the Smithsonian. And this was in 87 or 88 that this occurred. And so since then, I've been noodling on the idea, and you have people like Steve Quayle that's always out hunting up the giants and so on, and it's really easy to understand why they don't exist today. The estimation that the young woman, who is a trained biologist, by the way, said that and an anthropologist and had multiple degrees, And she said that her estimation was that the guy who was 11 feet high probably weighed on the order of 450 pounds just to have that kind of a frame. You know, his shoulder girth was nearly as wide as her torso.
Yeah.
On that note, Cliff, I don't know if you heard that Jim Vieira, the guy who did the Stone Builders YouTube, TEDx pulled that just recently.
No, I was unaware of that.
Yeah, they gave a long letter. Apparently, they felt they didn't vet him well enough to deserve TEDx credentials.
Weird.
Cliff, we've only got about 15, 20 minutes. Do you want to have a quick drink of water, or are you okay to
No,
go?
I'm fine. We're good. We're good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Patrick.
I was just thinking more near term. After the global coastal event, I suspect we're going to have problems with nuclear facilities going off just like Fukushima. If we're not powering down now, we're going to have problems with them in the future. So
even if we are powering down now, if there's a global coastal event, almost all of these are of the 140 in the United States and North America are coastal constrained in one way or another, either getting the water from that or something. And where are you going to put all the fuel rods and stuff that are left even after you power down? There's no hint in the data about that. There's a lot of stuff suggesting that especially if you go through the remote viewing work, that there is a big scramble to relocate after this stuff occurs. And a lot of it, I'm sure, is related to the nuke plants. Now, the nuke plant in California and any of those that are coastal in California are going to be totally destroyed, because the descriptions that we have from the one validation study, which admittedly is not as good as the Hawaii Remote Viewers Guild, but still has a lot of validity in the data so far, shows this wave that comes from the north, actually from the northwest, that runs along the coast of California, picks it up in northern California, and basically is like a bulldozer that just goes along and scrapes the whole side of the California mainland. There are intrusions in a couple of areas. We suspect from the data that the dikes around San Francisco break, and there's an intrusion of the water into the San Fernando valleys and into the Salton Sea area, as well as a lot of extensive damage in Los Angeles. But any nuke plants along there simply are gone. I don't know where they end up, but they're not there anymore.
Right. Your report on page 29 suggests that there'll be some fires and a restart and aggravation of radioactive air pollution problems. Does it make sense at this point to put priority on filtering radioactive contaminants from rainwater? Are there some practical things that we can do now?
Sure, there's a lot of different things you can do now. There's a lot of people that, for instance, are investing in underground shelters, which is fine, but you've got to be able to control, as you say, the radioactivity intrusion from both air and water. Air more difficult. Water is relatively easy to do, because you can find, for instance, that an algae-coated sand filter will take out almost all the particulate matter in water if your sand filter is deep enough. And sometimes all you need to do is have two sand filters, and it's the equivalent of like a Berkey. And you can filter vast quantities of water through these, and these are basically 30 to 55-gallon drums that have various different kinds of sand layered in them. And then you allow algae to grow in them, and you pump the water through them. Now, the algae, because the process is reasonably slow, even though it's forced, the algae has a chance to actively participate in scrubbing the water. Another way to approach it that people are doing is basically, I guess, fungal or mycelial masses that they're allowing to grow through ponds and stuff, and then take all the radioactivity out, and they pump the water out through there and run it past the Geiger counter, and it seems fairly decent. So you can do that. You can do sand filters. There's other forms of biological filtration. You can do clay filters. I've got a bunch of fire clay here, which will adhere to sand. You can bake it at a reasonably low temperature and get it to vitrify enough for the process, and then you can use that. The clay is porous. It works on trapping the radioactivity the same way that the green clay does when you ingest it, and it goes through your gut, and it kind of sweeps the radioactivity out of your gut. There's issues with the radioactivity at all these levels. At some point, it's going to become impractical to base all of your actions around that particular criteria. For instance, it may be that, yeah, we've got tons of radioactivity from the nuke plants, but what may be more pressing is all the smoke from the volcanoes. So it's just going to be hard to say how it's going to go. Now, the middle of the country is going to be just devastated. I'm hoping it's not going to be as bad as I think, but it may be that the absolute horrific drought we've got on the major continents in the northern hemisphere is going to lead to the mother of all wildfires, and that we may have several years of dealing with wood smoke. There's an indication that this occurred the last cycle. There's also an indication that 5,000, at the time of the last long count when they started it, 5,115 years ago, that during the period of rapid glaciation in the Andes and in the area around the Matterhorn and that area of Switzerland, Central Europe, at that time we were also dealing with a lot of wildfires around the planet in the northern hemisphere because a lot of the smoke particulates got trapped in the ice. An exceptional number of smoke particulates were trapped in this layer of the ice in Europe, and everybody kind of wondered where it had come from. It may have been that there was a drought then, and we had the similar conditions in major, pretty much planet-wide forest fires. But it's going to be ugly, yeah. The nuke plants I don't worry about so much. I'm not going to live that long. If I were a lot younger, it would be a higher concern.
Patrick, you had anything else to add?
Well, I was just trying to focus on what we can do now. Maybe indoor gardening is in my future.
That's what I do now. Unfortunately, as much as I'm really enthralled with hugelkultur and long-term outdoor growing that way, the only designed outdoor growing we're going to do is going to be for fruit trees, and that'll only be until fruit and nut trees, and that'll only be until I can get them under domes. So my goal is ultimately to have the entire food supply in some form of a greenhouse.
Yeah, Clif, you talked about I think in an email we were exchanging that you're kind of hopeful that that maybe a lot of lost knowledge would be passed on chi masters, and I guess that's why you've been concentrating a few of the videos on developing your chakras and stuff. So so you think that that's obviously a place that we could probably look at as well for post GC global the global coastal event.
I actually think it's a weird side effect. It's one of those unintended consequences, because look what's happening here. I've personally been doing yoga since I was 11, and I've run into a lot of people that, for whatever reason, atypical to their culture, they picked up these esoteric practices at some point in a young age, and they've continued them all their life. And most of these people that are like myself in that regard are also what I would consider to be non-sheeple in the awake and aware community. And these are the people I suspect will survive in a greater number than the sheeple. Therefore, we will have a greater concentration of people that are aware of the, if you will, the spiritual technologies in the concentration of the society than we do now. And that cannot but activate a change in the greater society. And that makes a lot of sense, because way back when, in that 2003 data set, that really long-term data set, we had some stuff in there that the very far edge of it that was out at the multi-generational level, which would have placed it then, say, from 2025 onward into the 2040s and 50 range, that suggested that the area that we call the United States, North America, would not be the United States as we understand it now, and by the time 2025 rolled around, and would, in many regards, resemble the spiritual bent that we see in India, although, albeit, if you will, with a cowboy frame of reference or an American frame of reference to things. And that for whatever reason, the shift in energies was going to take the people that live on this continent after the global coastal event that are existent in 2025, they will be to the planet what the Hindu population was of years past in terms of being the host of the spiritual masters, as opposed to being the mercantile, war class people that we are now. A radical transformation in our society, which I don't think could come without the participation of the violence of universe. We have all of the things that are set up for just that kind of a long-term data showing up. And if we go through the global coastal event, I would say that anybody that hears these words could be pretty assured that there will be some form of that occurring by 2025, just because of the discontinuous nature of the global coastal event, its impact on our technology. It will bump us out of the warrior class and the warrior mode and the mercantile mode and put us into a much more spiritual mode as we try and survive. And also, we will be predominantly, or we will be dominated by people that will be awake and aware. Because now, look what's going to happen, right? All of us guys, we know this earthquake's coming. Even if you don't believe me now, you have knowledge in your head that this earthquake's coming, and you live up in this area. And you're hearing this interview later tonight and into tomorrow or whenever. And so a few months down the road, this earthquake happens, and your brain just automatically says, aha, it's here. It's going on. I know it's happening. I'm going to start reacting. Well, everybody else is going to say, aha, earthquake. And that's as far as they're going to go with it. All of the sheeple are just going to extend it that far, and then they're going to be involved with, caught up in the process of dealing with the immediacy of that particular catastrophe that they're in right at that moment. But the awake and the aware person will have a much larger view of what's going on. They will be the people that will be getting out ahead of the crowds, because they will know this is not just merely an earthquake, that this was a situation where, obviously they're able to match the level of damage they see around in their eyes with the descriptions that they're hearing from our words now, and they will take those actions as they deem appropriate, and more of these individuals will survive, simply because of this level of being awake and aware. And they will carry that forward, and they will have these will be the people around which the organizations will cluster, just as we see in the remote viewing, where this poor fellow who looks like David Wilcock, who may not be David Wilcock, but is nonetheless in the position of being thought of as knowing something by these other survivors. And now, in our situation here in the Northwest, when someone comes to me and says, okay, I'm shell-shocked, I don't know what's going on, and so on, I'll say, okay, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go gather that wood. We're building a giant rocket mass heater to heat this school or something, whatever our task is at the moment, because I will be not as shell-shocked, I won't be as overwhelmed, and there will be potentially thousands of people like me that will be in that situation of being able to stand up and say, yo, I know what's happening, do this.
It's interesting you say that, Cliff, because I know some of the Eastern masters felt that the West was actually going to be the fertile ground for energy arts and cultivation, etc. I know they felt that we were sort of at the cusp of a materialistic period, whereas China and some of the Eastern countries were sort of in the throes of materialism. So I know some of them did actually want to transplant that knowledge over here.
Well, it sort of worked, and then also when we think of what's happening with these breakaway civilization guys, they're dealing with technology that is inherently consciousness in a non-electromagnetic form as an energy that they're interacting with, and this brings up all of these spiritual issues. And since we're the center of the breakaway civilization, after the crash, that technology will come on out, and people like myself will say, "Oh yeah, I understand that. I can see auras, and so I can even see some of these energies and know what's going on with it, and be able to interact with it far better than people that were more compartmentalized and thinking in a different way." And a lot of it has to do with the spiritual bent that has been, as you say, been transplanted here.
The reason why I asked Cliff the original question is that, people tend to look for external solutions, like Patrick was asking, growing food, that's an external solution, other things like that. But there might be another side to it, like an internal solution. Like if you had your chi developed to a high level, can you expel radiation, without needing to detoxify water, for example, things like that?
Sure. Yes, you can. I have got my ki. I don't know if I could do radiation, but I've gotten my ki to the point where I was actually able to cure incurable diseases in my body. Eczema for one, where it just, the doctor was, he was mad at me. He was pissed. He wanted to slap me because it just did not make any sense to him, because the disease was incurable, and yet there was no sign I'd ever had it from, 30-day period of time. And I didn't know, he demanded to know what I put it on there, because he was sure that I had developed some kind of solution that would, work, and probably saw dollar signs and all of this. But yes, you could do that. I know an individual who's now dead who actually did an experiment in which he was able to flush radiation from his body very rapidly. This experiment was done under the auspices of a radioactive study that was ongoing anyway, and the guy was key-filled, and he needed money, and he did a study up here at the U of W. And this was written up, and even probably even track it down on the internet these days. I don't know if they've got it out there, but in one of the radioactive studies, the dye usually takes 5 to 6 hours to exit the system. This was a guy who was a yoga master, and like I say, he was a student up there at the time, and it just I don't know, for grins and chuckles or whatever, he told the study guys, well, I need to get out of here. I'm not going to stay here for 5 hours. If I just pee it all out now, can I go? And they laughed at him and said, well, if you can deliver X number of Roentgen's level of material in X number of milliliters of urine, yes, you can leave. And if we sweep you and you're clean, you can leave. And he did just that. 30 minutes later, he peed out all of the radioactive material. They swept him, and he left. Everybody else was there for 5 hours, and it was so exceptional that it ended up getting its own little write-up. So, yes, this is possible to do. I've never explored that. I'm sure it's it's beyond my ability. Although I sure wish I had it at the moment. But it's amazing what you can do with this energy. Now imagine what you can do when you can blend it with the energy at a technology level, where you've got machinery and computers and stuff that can assist you.
Very true, and Cliff, and I think we'll be looking at trying to organize some interviews with some of these chi masters, hopefully in the future. Yeah, so that was the reasoning for that. External solutions are great, but internal ones we sometimes neglect.
Well, there's also another aspect of it too that I've always brought up to George Ure, because George has always had this mindset, monkey mindset, that we can hop in his airplane and beat it out of Dodge before this gets him, right? And my point to him was that this will come so suddenly that most of the people that survive will thereafter not have anything that they've prepared for or with, and they will have to be prepared to survive on their education alone. And you can do this. You can literally start walking across this country with no food in your hand and live off things you find along the side of the road quite adequately. And if you know what to eat and what to look for. And it is the knowledge that allows you to survive, not the cans of freeze-dried food that, in my mind, isn't food really at all, and you don't get that much nutrition from, but also that can be snatched away from you simply because the wave picks you up and hurls you out, or you're sitting there and your house is destroyed because there's a huge level of wind and something you hadn't anticipated falls on top of your house, and so all of your goods are gone and you're deprived of everything but your education. So it's good to educate yourself, and you've got months now. You can acquire vast quantities of education free that will allow you to survive: how to build rocket stoves, how to live off of weeds, how to cultivate medicines from lichens and mosses, how to identify necessary minerals, geology. All of these different kinds of things are going to be very, very necessary. The more of these things you know, the better off you're going to be. It'll be those people that know this stuff that will be the leaders after this event occurs, not the politicians, not the military, not that kind of thing.
So based on your just a couple more questions, Cliff. Based on your what you just said, you're feeling 90% sure, based on the information from remote viewing as well, that this global coastal event will occur by June 2013?
No, 100% sure. I mean, it's crushing. It's an emotional burden that I can't escape. If I were a different individual, I wouldn't bear it. It is that certain. The remote viewing stuff put the capper on it. When I had the global coastal event, I always knew in the back of my mind it was going to occur just based on that. Then I saw the remote viewing stuff from Courtney Brown. I was basically shocked. And then I commissioned the remote viewing studies, the validation studies. Took me over the 100% level because they have involved myself and Kathy in a time stream that is playing out as we speak. And so this is why we need a different form of language, because it is difficult for me to talk about this process and my emotions relative to it, because our language sees it as a stop-action event. And when I say global coastal event, it's actually a global coastal process. But that is not going to get your attention the same way, because it's not going to end there. The earthquakes, the water intrusion, that's not the end of it. It's going to go on for years as the planet continues to expand and go through all these changes and then gradually settles down. It might take a number of decades, 4 or 5, who knows? And we have to be prepared to go through all of this. In my mind, it has occurred because of the validation studies. Any doubt I had was removed when Kathy had her heart attack and we went through this, because it was so much a key component predicted in the validation studies.
Cliff, looking for some optimism here at the end of the world and all that, what about the new electrics? You'd had a lot of discussion about that and how that could really possibly make the rebuilding process go really well. Any thoughts on that now?
Yeah, that'll be occurring, but our and it'll be occurring. The issue for the planet as a whole is that the global coastal event is going to be a discontinuous event for those of us that are deprived of communications from that point on. So from the time the global coastal event occurs here in the United States, we don't know what's going on. But at that point, it's still the development of both time technology, which is really cool, and the new electrics is going to occur in huge rapid bursts, as we've talked about in India, Siberia, and South Africa. And ultimately, they'll be seeking resources out of Canada that at this point, I think Canada is the only place we've found them, but I don't know that it's the only place on the planet. And so that our data suggested that the first new information we would have about the new electrics was when the people that are living here and rebuilding on the North American continent are reintroduced to the rest of the social order of the planet, if you will, by active commerce seeking this particular material. Might be years, though. I mean, we just don't have any sure way of knowing how long the isolation will be and how extensive. So, in other words, because of the global coastal event, things like the undersea cables disappear. So we won't have transcontinental communication that does not involve satellites. But at the same time, all of our satellite structures are damaged and gone wonky because of plasma. So our data would suggest that global communication infrastructure disappears for some period of time, and for a longer period of time for those people in North America than other areas, because we were so devastated, if you will, and our infrastructure is not capable of withstanding the damage that we're going to encounter. We will have a longer period rebuilding. And so all kinds of activity will be happening on the rest of the planet that we just won't be aware of. And then all of a sudden we'll be presented with this as more or less accomplished facts. And that was sort of the view that was presented by that long-term data set from back in 2003. And it described the United States or the North American continent in a different fashion, in a different collective, more of a confederacy in the mid-20s. And at that point, we start, the remnants of the people that are here start participating more actively in the new electrics and so on. But we've missed a lot.
Have you got a local shortwave network there in the Seattle area?
I'm sure there is, but I'm not into the...
Replace the internet once it goes down?
Yeah, I'm sure there is, but I'm not involved in that, and I'm not sure shortwave will be viable because, again, the atmospheric problems.
Good point.
Thanks, Plain. As we close down this discussion, Cliff. First of all, can you just address the data flood discontinuity data gap? How has it changed, if it has changed over the course of your 15 years of doing this? And have you got any final comments that you want to say?
The data is really interesting because when we first started out, and I'm thinking these days it was a logical consequence of the growth of the technology of the internet. But when we first started out, we had far more long-term data than we did short-term, and far more short-term than we did immediacy. And I'm talking in the early 90s. And so in the 1990s, I would have preponderance of long-term data to the maybe 2 to 3 times what I would get with short-term, and maybe 10 or 20 times what I would get with the immediacy data. And now that's all changed. I can't even see the long-term or shorter-term data because of the immediacy data. Now, I suspect this is a natural outgrowth of the internet because of the following. Long-term data has a tendency to concentrate on legalistic, corporate kind of language that have a long-term impact on humans. Legal language, when you're served with a summons, you know your life is going to be screwed until that summons is dealt with, and that this is some point in the future. It has no immediacy value other than the immediacy shock, but it has huge long-term duration values. And so I suspect that just because of the nature of the internet, as we computerized, those things that were first put on the net were all the long-term data kind of elements, all of the discussions about contracts, legal sort of things, as government and everybody else basically started digitizing all of their information stores. And I suspect that this has been a natural change over time to where we now have all of those long-term data stores in the main digitized and on the net. Except as we encounter new populations that have yet to reach the net, even that's rare. And so as a result, I think that long-term data is basically subsumed to a level that it just won't ever increase, and that the reason we have the giant level of immediacy data is because so many people are out there discussing so many things. And the more people, the more immediacy data. Now, immediacy data is much more prescient in terms of focus on the future, but it has very low shelf life. runs out after about 3 weeks. You can't really get any long-term projections out of it. So we think we have a new way of operating. Should the internet come back in the future, we can, after the global coastal event, we could set something up to tap the immediacy data, but I don't suspect that that's going to change over time because, as I say, I think all the long-term data and basically the short-term data is this amalgamation of the two, immediacy and long-term. And so I think we're just stuck in a situation that from this point on, we'll have to mine for the longer-term data information to get a longer-term view in a different way than we had to initially when it was so easily exposed. So that has altered our work over time, and it sort of makes sense as to why we had that really good long-term data set in the 2003 to 2005 period, and that was because of the huge rush of everybody getting on the net and all this stuff being dumped, and a lot of people, a lot of corporations paying to have their back records put in and digitized and these sort of things. And given all of that, under our current circumstances, with the immediacy data the way it is, we do have a method of operation, assuming that things were to go forward. Now, what we've done is actually we're preparing a end of the Baktun report here that lays out all these temporal markers and takes us up over a lot of the stuff that we've discussed today and fills in a lot of the gaps. I should have that out by the end of this month, before January 1. But basically, it's going to be looking at the next 6 months and lay out these temporal markers in as linear a fashion as we can, and then hopefully tie them together as best as we can. So you can say, okay, this one has shown up. Now in the background, we ought to be able to find this as well, if we're, and presumably we're still on that track in that timeline. And I'm quite convinced now, in terms of like closing remarks, that the idea of multiple timelines is bogus. The idea of time being mutable is invalid as well. It is changeable, but the very nature of time itself suggests that those changes are almost pre-worked into the system as probabilities, and so you have a set level of constraints you're dealing with relative to the time. It is unfortunate that I was stupid enough to place myself in a position of getting this advanced knowledge of what's going on and had to suffer that advanced knowledge as well. But the instant validation of having gone through what Kathy and I have done this last couple of months has raised my level of certainty on the global coastal event to, like I say, 100%, insofar as it's been described for my reaction from the remote viewing section. So I know I'm going to be living through a very large earthquake followed by water intrusion at some point, and thereafter the water intrusion component of it will settle down. So the global coastal event will be more violent here in the Pacific, but it'll settle down quicker in the Pacific. It'll be less impacting initially in the far reaches away from the Pacific, Finland and the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and this kind of thing. But it will be more disturbing totally to those areas when it finally occurs. So there's something we haven't touched on. The water level rise here might be 50 meters, 48 to 50 meters here in Puget Sound, and it might only be 48 to 50 meters in Finland, but when it finally gets to Finland, it will not be as it is here. When that 50 meters comes ashore, it'll come ashore all at once. It won't be this gradual tidal flow. It'll be a very long-term, slow-moving wave that just builds and builds and builds, and eventually reaches to the point where it breaks the shore level and then just continues to build and come on in. So a couple of years from now, the more northern regions of the planet really will have to worry about this, and the level of flooding that we saw from that is going to be quite severe. But also at that point, curiously, some component of that's going to affect Siberia, and that actually ties into the new electrics, because I think that's whatever's going on in Siberia. And in fact, it may even be those diamonds, now that I think about it. In Siberia, they found this channel of meteor-created diamonds. These diamonds are unlike ordinary diamonds on the planet. There's so many of these diamonds there that De Beers is effectively out of the diamond business, and diamonds are now as plentiful as sand almost. And these diamonds that they've got are these ones that were created by the meteor impact, are extraordinarily hard and have special properties. And I'm wondering right now if those aren't some of the crystals that start off the new electrics. That curiously, that I hadn't connected that until now, but indeed that may be the case, because we'd already seen the Siberian start of this whole process, and it was associated with the time period of the global coastal event.
Well, thank you for that, Cliff. we'll be waiting for that end of Baktun report, but personally and factually, it should be called the start of Baktun. But anyway, thanks, Cliff, for coming to our dinner tonight. We hope the food we provided was tasty for you. Food for the spirit is always the best type of food. On behalf of Fox and all the members of Time Monk Radio and Webbot Forum, may you and your family have many pies to come. It sure seems like we're going to need it. Thanks, Cliff.
I think so, too. Thank you very much, guys. It's been fitting that we end this way, yeah. I mean, end our Baktun this way.